Today I'm speaking with Ralph Ellis. Ralph, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, nice to be with you again, Tim. It's been a long time, hasn't it?
Yeah, we were just talking about how it's been almost a year, and it's crazy to think about how quickly that year has passed and all that's happened in this year, but I'm so glad to have you back. Your first interview on my YouTube channel really got a lot of attention. I think it's one of the most popular ones on the channel, and a lot of people the feedback was phenomenal. They said they just loved how much insight and new ideas that you brought to the table. So I just thank you for being a guest again.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And yes, I took a look on there, and it was pretty much 95% positive, wasn't it? I was quite surprised. Yeah, to have so many positives on it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a thirst for people just wanting to say there's obviously so much more information than our pastors or theologians would have given us. And it's just like a desert, and when you have someone that's willing to say, hey, I've gotten some water, let's talk about this. It really does draw a crowd because people want to understand this, the whole Stockholm syndrome thing that I think we talked about last time, where people get out of it, but they don't just want to say, well, I'm done with Christianity now that I know it's mythology or whatever. They want to say, what was it? What was I actually involved in? And it helps. But in terms of giving a brief bio here as we get started, Ralph Ellis, for anyone that doesn't know Ralph, Ralph has been researching biblical and Egyptian history for more than 30 years. He is an independent scholar who, because of his independence from the mainline theological and educational establishments, it's allowed Ralph to go where others have not dared to go. And through this independence, Ralph has discovered many new biblical and historical truths. And one of the biggest ones that we talked about briefly last time, we might touch on again, is the fact that the Israelites were originally Egyptians, the Hyksos shepherd pharaohs who were ejected from Egypt. And in terms of your bigger picture, you have done a lot of work. You were a software engineer. You've gone through jobs including mineral surveying, aviation, paleoclimatology, but this archaeological interest has always been a big part of your world. As a historian, Ralph has toured the Mediterranean for more than 3 decades, searching for secular similarities and parallels between the apparently disparate disciplines of history and theology, and that research has been very fruitful, with many new fundamental discoveries being made mostly in Egypt. And Ralph has helped uncover many possibilities regarding the true identity and genealogy of the biblical Jesus in the historical record and of how Christianity began and evolved. So do you want to add anything to that bio, Ralph?
No, that's pretty comprehensive, actually. Yeah, it's my life. Might sound sad to some people, but I enjoy it. I wouldn't do it if I didn't enjoy it. And yeah, I've just been on, this sort of quest for truth because I didn't understand the truth. I don't want to. I think we went through this a lot on the previous one, but from a very young age, I didn't understand how this story can be so disconnected from reality, and that was the reality I was looking for. And we'll probably go through that when we talk about Solomon. So yeah, that's sort of been an all-consuming sort of rationale, meaning to life, seeking out what had happened in the past and putting it back into rational history, which I think I've been quite successful at. Actually, it's been quite good.
Yeah. And in terms of your work, just adding to that, your books, you are an author. I didn't mention that before, but your books include Cleopatra to Christ, King Jesus, Jesus, King of Edessa, The Grail Cipher, Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, Tempest in Exodus, Solomon, Pharaoh of Egypt, Eden in Egypt, Scota, the Egyptian Queen of the Scots, and Mary Magdalene, Princess of Orange. And are there any other books on the radar, I should ask, anytime soon?
Coming up soon. No, I haven't started writing one for quite some time. I've been doing more of this interviews and promotion and things of that nature, because there's no point writing these books if nobody reads them. So we've at some point you've got to put the books aside and start the promotion so that people actually get to hear of these ideas, because that's the whole point. There's no point writing in isolation. Yeah. I do have things that I want to write about, but I haven't got the time. So I'm looking forward to sort of retirement time when I can sort of quit the day job and start doing maybe some more research and writing. I have a book in mind because I never know what I'm going to write about. My books happen. because you don't necessarily know the subject until you've researched it. And so until you've started the book, you've got no idea what you're going to write about. My book on Edessa started at a time when I had never heard of Edessa.
Hmm.
And it wasn't a book on Edessa at all. It was a book on Queen Helena, the famous queen we were talking about last time. And suddenly in that research, I came across this pivotal city and principality called Edessa. And it changed the whole character of the book. So you never quite know how the book is going to end up when you start this research. But anyway, I've got an idea on the kings of Emesa in the 1st century. So we had 2 parallel kingdoms. We had Edessa and Emesa. And nobody really writes about Emesa. So I want to do a bit of research on that, but it's going to be a long haul, that one, I think, because there's not very much data to actually go on. But we'll see what we can find.
Yeah. Well, not to beat a dead horse, because I know people that listen to me kind of hear this stuff a lot, but I love how what you're doing in both the specifics and the broad picture is you're saying, look, there's parts of this story, that meaning the Jesus Christianity story, that you just aren't going to hear from your pastor and theologian, and that need to be brought in. And I was just speaking with someone else recently about how strange it is to me how I'm involved in so many discussions about Christian origins, and yet there's a few big ideas that just don't seem to come to the table. Some of them related to your books and topics you bring up, Edessa. I hear very few people talking about the Book of Enoch. I hear very few people talking about the Essenes and the Qumran community. Very few people talking about Egypt, which you bring in a lot. It was so much of this stuff came right out of Egypt, and that's clear. Obviously, a lot of Greco-Roman stuff mixed in too, but just all of these topics. Where are the people saying, let's dive deeply into the details of the Book of Enoch or of Egypt or of all these topics, or even of some of the related ones like Pythagoras and so forth. And it's so critical. And I love that you're doing it. And I know that some of it's controversial, and I appreciate that you're willing to put up with the pushback. I get a lot of pushback too I'm doing something very different from you, but I could put my pushback in my vein of work, but it's worth it, because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is freeing people from a prison for the mind. And we're saying, look, there's a better life, and it's basically related to truth. The truth will set you free. But with that, as an introduction, I would love to just pick your brain on some topics here that we decided on in advance, starting with the identity of King Solomon. So if you want to tell us what's on your mind about him.
Yeah, this is one of these forgotten histories, one of these hidden histories. And I've been in contact with Finkelstein, the great archaeologist, historian from Israel, about this. And it's typical of the establishment that he can't take on board these ideas. He had no way of contradicting what I said, but he said, well, just because their names are the same doesn't mean they are the same people. Yeah, okay, but it wasn't just one name or 2 names, it was like a dozen. So we'll go through this and see why Finkelstein ought to be thinking again about his assessment of the United Monarchy. So we have this very famous monarchy from Israel. We're talking sort of 900 BC here. They call it the United Monarchy, King David, King Solomon. And there is a problem with the United Monarchy. And it's the same problem we've seen with the Jesus story and the Saul story, because the United, or the Exodus story, come to that, which we also spoke about. The United Monarchy is missing from the historical record. Now, how can that be? This is a very famous monarchy, a very powerful monarchy. People came, other monarchs came to give tribute from all over the region. They were very wealthy. They had obviously a lot of infrastructure. I mean, 400 chariots and things of this nature. There would have been a lot of infrastructure supporting this monarchy, 900 BC, Jerusalem based. And Finkelstein and Silberman, the great archaeologists from Israel, have been poking around that region, doing the archaeology. And their conclusion is that Jerusalem was no more than a village, circa 10th century, circa 900 BC. Now, that's a problem because there is no David, there is no Solomon, there is no empire, there is no palace, there is no real Jerusalem. It was no more than a village. So how can this be? We come back to those options again. Either we're looking in the wrong era, or we're looking in the wrong location. Or I suppose the third option is it's complete fantasy, which some people say, of course. Some people, the minimalists, I think they call them, will say that it's a fairy story. It's fictional because there is no evidence. And I don't blame them for saying that. And so you get this, it becomes a very contentious issue, of course, especially within Israel, because that's the whole point of Israel being there. It was reestablished in 47, whenever it was, because that's where the Israelites came from. Now, if they didn't come from there, perhaps the whole basis for the settlement of Israel is based on a misconception. And we'll see that it was and it wasn't, because they were there from 600 BC, after the Babylonian exile. When they came back from the Babylonian exile, they were most definitely in Israel at that time, but not, it appears, in the 950s BC, when the United Monarchy should be around. So how can we square this circle? How can we...
Can I ask a quick interjection?
Yeah.
Could you plug in a timeline for me in terms of the Hyksos part of this?
Okay, yes. Yeah, going back into history then, we talked about the Hyksos Exodus. Now, the Hyksos Exodus, I said, was the great Israelite Exodus, because they are the same. And that is reliably dated to about 1580 BC, under my dating, because it's attached to the eruption of Thera, Santorini. And so we have a very, very firm date for that, a wonderful chronological peg that you can hang everything upon. So the Hyksos Exodus, which I say was the great Israelite Exodus, 1580 BC. Okay. Then we run through history and we come to the small Exodus, which I say has been conflated within the biblical story into one story. But the small Exodus was the Exodus of the Amana kings. That's King Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And that would have been 1320 BC. And that's coming up to the classical date for the Exodus. So the classical date for the Exodus is about, if I remember correctly, 1250 BC, because of the mention of Pi Ramesses and the link to Ramesses II. And so theologians and historians will link it into Ramesses II because of this mention of Pi Ramesses. I mean, there is no other data really to go on. It's a very nebulous date.
So this divided kingdom period is several hundred years, quite a few hundred years after that period.
Yes. Okay. The reason they say it is Pi Ramesses and linked to Ramesses II is because, the mention of Pi Ramesses, but Pi Ramesses was Avaris, and Avaris was the city of the Hyksos. So you can see where you can get confused. The same city had two different names. And then we had the period of the judges. So there was a calm period, as it were. We had the period of the judges, which I've not written about, actually. I've mentioned this on a few occasions in a few of the books, but it needs fleshing out. The period of the judges, in my view, was the Sea People invasion of Egypt and the Levant. Because remember, all of these people were pushed out on a big exodus. And they didn't just go to Jerusalem. They went to Greece and they went to the Mediterranean islands all over the place. And then 400 years later, well, about that, between sort of 1580 BC and 1100 BC, all of the islands of the Mediterranean ganged up on Egypt for no reason. And they got together a flotilla of 1,000 ships and attacked Egypt. And nobody knows why this happened. Why did the small islands, we're talking, the Balearics, Mallorca, Sardinia, the Greek islands as well, and the Greeks themselves, because some of them were Greek. Why did the islands around the Mediterranean suddenly gang up on the superpower of that era, which was Egypt? What was the rationale? How did they think they would succeed? Just minor little islands against the superpower. Why did this happen? And they very nearly did succeed, actually. They beat Egypt back down to Thebes. I mean, it was a resounding success in some fashion. My answer, which needs fleshing out in more research, but I've never got round to it because I don't have the time, is this was the returning Hyksos. So they were kicked out 1580 BC. They had 400 years odd sitting, licking their wounds in the islands around the Mediterranean. And then they came back on force, and they arranged, they obviously still had contact with each other, obviously. And they organized this mass invasion of Egypt, and nearly defeated Egypt. And that's
Would you
known
have
as
called it like a revenge?
Oh yeah, very much so. They wanted their homelands back again.
Okay.
That's the whole rationale. Now we have a proper rationale why the Sea People invasion actually happened. It was to regain their homeland, which was A, it was their homeland, B, it was sacred. These were the sacred lands of Egypt. And that was the reason for the invasion. Now we have a rationale for this very incongruous Sea People invasion of Egypt. And it so happens that the attack by the Sea People is the same as the attack by the judges within the book of Judges. The way they attacked was exactly the same. They attacked by night with pots with fire inside them. And when they got close to the camp of the enemy, they broke the pots. So all you could see was a line of fire all around the camp. And that's how they defeated, as it were, the Egyptians.
Yeah, like the
it's
Gideon
the same.
story.
So the story is the same. And we have this story from Ramesses III, which is when this happened. It's on the walls of the temple at Luxor. And we have the story from Judges, and it's exactly the same story. So there's another thing that hasn't been fully fleshed out and fully explored yet. So that period leads us up. Yeah.
Can I ask, just for the sake of someone that maybe hasn't watched our first interview and maybe hasn't become aware of some concepts, what you're espousing in a very broad sense is that some of the stories that we read in the Bible are, in a sense, actually history.
True history.
The names and the places have been changed to protect people or to alter the stories or to merge two stories. Kind of like we already, a lot of us already know that, Genesis 1-2 has, different creation stories that have been merged. The Noah story has parts that have been merged. But you're saying that trend doesn't just start, and go through just Genesis 1-5 or whatever. This is like all throughout the Bible. They're merging stories and they're changing names.
They're doing it deliberately because there is a problem with the biblical account, which anyone can see if you read it and sort of read it with a critical mind. Why is Pharaoh called Pharaoh? Why don't we ever have the name of the Pharaoh? Deliberately, all the way through the Old Testament, apart from a couple of mentions in the later sections, we have a mention of Sheshonk, and we have a mention of Tarque. There's about 2 mentions of Pharaoh within the Old Testament. The rest of the time, all you get is Pharaoh. So you can't tie it into real history because no one will give you the name of the Pharaoh. And that's been done deliberately because they didn't want you to know the events and the era of what was actually going on. And so they just delete the name for Pharaoh.
Do you think that
And
there was some kind of, like, did they have to do that to protect themselves, or like, or was it more of an
yeah,
esoteric
because
meaning,
the
or?
story, the story has changed. The story is the same. However, the import of that story has been changed. It's been changed because they wanted to portray themselves as slaves at the mercy of these evil Egyptians. And they're telling a story of persecution because that's a great sell. You know, if you want to sell a story to your people to keep them together as a people, you know, when you've been kicked out of a country or something, you say, oh, but we were just, you know, poor innocent people, and these evil Egyptians, they kicked us out of Egypt. Oh, it's terrible. Stay together as a group, you know, keep together. When the actual story is, if they were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt, they were the most powerful people in the whole of the world. They controlled all of northern Egypt, lower Egypt. They were pharaohs themselves. Okay, well, that changes the story somewhat, doesn't it? No, you're no longer a persecuted poor people, just slaves at the hands of the evil Egyptians. Actually, you were in control, and you still managed to get kicked out. That's a more difficult to sell, isn't it, to your people? That we were controlling the whole of this region and we still got kicked out. And the reason they got kicked out, of course, is because they were a small controlling authority. You can, I think we mentioned this before, if you view the Hyksos, i.e. the Israelites, the Hyksos Israelites, as I always call them, as being the British in India, the British Raj. We, as Britain, we controlled the whole of India for hundreds of years, but there was never more than a couple of 100,000 of the British in India controlling the whole of India. So it didn't take much of a change of attitude within India for the Britons to all get kicked out. And we had to go on an exodus, which is exactly what happened. So imagine the Hyksos being in that same position. And so they were a small controlling authority. They ran the nation, but they were never a large part of the population. And they got kicked out. And yeah, that was a more difficult sell for the later theologians who were crafting this new religion from this history. And so they distorted it. And certain things got missed out or changed, so you didn't know what the actual story was. They couldn't call themselves the Hyksos, but they called themselves shepherds. You know, all of the patriarchs were shepherds. And who were the Hyksos? The Hyksos were the shepherd kings. So they're not actually changing the story that much if you can see through the, you know, surface level deceit and start putting the jigsaw puzzle together underneath. It all fits together. So it was only small elements, and we'll see this again in the Solomon story. It was only small elements that were changed. The other obvious change that's happened, and we'll go through this as well because we will want to know about this, is do a search in online biblical text. Do a search for pyramid. Doesn't happen. Not there. How can the Israelites spend 400 years in Egypt and never see a pyramid? There have been amendments to this story to put it into a slightly different context. And we'll go through that as well later on in this talk. But coming back to the United Monarchy, we
Let's add it before you go into the monarchy. One last thought. Yep. This is a great example of how people who are trying to be scientific and have a true historian's heart in these matters, they have to understand and admit history gets rewritten. I mean, we see it even in our current day of the internet and CNN. We see people trying to rewrite history of stuff that just happened a month ago or a year ago, trying to redefine terms and say what was good and bad. And you know, people that are trying to do basically terrorist acts, trying to make them look like patriots or vice versa. And, people in the internet age can try to rewrite history. How much
Oh,
easier would it have been in an era when most people were illiterate and there was certainly no news or internet? I mean, it would have been exponentially easier.
throughout history. I mean, we have. I'm sure you have the same in America, but we've got a variety of newspapers in Britain, and we've got one called the Guardian, or the Groniad, as people who know the paper well call it. And then we have the Daily Mail. Poles apart. The Guardian is left wing, the Daily Mail is right wing, and you can read the same story on the same day, the same events, and the two newspapers will present them in two entirely different fashions. And you wouldn't even believe that they are talking about the same event.
Mm.
And that's just two views of two different editors in two newspapers. Yeah, you cannot trust your history because it depends which one of these newspapers wins the day, as it were.
Yeah. And especially when you consider that the separation of religion and state was not a thing until relatively recently, that everything was through the state, and religion and the state worked together, and they controlled, the state controlled the religion, and religion influenced the state dramatically. And you have that in the context where the priests and the kings have so much power, and almost everybody is illiterate. It's very easy to craft the story the way you want it.
Well, you can see it in the text from Ramesses III when he's talking about the Sea People invasion, and he's saying, this is propaganda, obviously. He's saying the Sea People came in and we defeated them, and in order to make them comfortable, we gave them cloth and we gave them oil and we gave them this and we gave them that. Well, hold on a minute. If you've won, if you've won the battle, you don't give someone all of these. They were obviously being extorted. They were having to give tribute to the Sea People, and he's sort of portraying this as a great victory over the Sea People. Pure propaganda, pure propaganda. But that's how they wrote it, and that's exactly how we would write it today as well.
Yeah, and when you realize that that's what has happened in history over and over and over, it really is like special pleading to say, when you bring it up to slightly more modern times, when you say, well, that was true, that all these stories got rewritten, and you can't trust the standard history necessarily for all these times, BC. But when you get to like the early church era, surely these church councils, and surely these, Constantine and all the people involved in that time frame, surely there was no propaganda and manipulation of the story then.
Yes,
it's like, come on, your special pleading is showing through. It's like, this is ridiculous.
That's why people who research this, theologians with an open mind, they call Eusebius the most dishonest historian in history, because everything Eusebius said had a Christian slant to it. He wasn't writing history; he was writing Christian propaganda.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for letting me to ask about that rabbit trail. But if you want to take us back to the to the King Solomon story, feel free.
It's very pertinent to the Solomon story because, as we've already said, this united monarchy is missing from the historical record, just not there. So which of these three options do we take? Is it the wrong location, the wrong era, or is it fantasy? Is it a fictional story? Looking through it, I'm trying to remember how I discovered this. I don't think this was a eureka moment. I think this was a process of slow discovery. But what I found was a monarchy that was suspiciously similar to the United Monarchy, and they have the same names. So if we go through some of the ancestors of King David, we have Ram. Well, okay, well that sounds a bit like Ramesses, doesn't it? Okay, we have Aminabdab, which sounds a bit like Amenazbanabjet. Oh, okay, well that sounds similar. We have Nashon, which sounds like Amenanashu. I'm comparing here biblical names with the 20th dynasty or 21st dynasty of Egypt. And then we have the biblical Salmon, which sounds rather like the pharaonic name Siamun. Salmon, Siamun. Boaz, famous patriarch, sounds like Buas-Archon, another pharaoh. Obed sounds like Amenemopet. Obed, Opet. And then, of course, the next person in line is King David. Okay, so the line of King David sounds very much like the 20th dynasty of Egypt, going into the 21st dynasty, because the David character would have been, I think, the first, anyway, one of the 21st dynasty of Egypt. And his name is Susens. Well, that's the Greek rendering. In Egypt, he was called Paseba-kha-en-nuit, and he was a pharaoh of Egypt, which sounds nothing like David, of course. But, oh yes, that's what I was doing. I was looking for attributes because the names obviously change. Dialects, accents, languages, the names change. So I was looking for attributes and what is King David actually known for? And in the modern world, he's well known for the city of David and the Star of David. And there is a pharaoh of Egypt, and we're talking exactly the same era. So we're not changing the era at all. All we're doing is changing the location. There is a pharaoh of Egypt who's also known for his star and his city. And that's Paseba-kha-en-nuit, Susens. And his name means, my star rises in my city, Paseba-kha-en-nuit. He is the city of David and the king of David. And you might say, well, the Greek rendering especially, but the Egyptian, Paseba-kha-en-nuit, doesn't sound like David at all. Well, it depends how you translate the glyphs, doesn't it? Because many of these glyphs had similar forms and different pronunciations. And this is one of those famous ones. And the star glyph can either be Seba or it can be Duat. Okay, so let's plug the other pronunciation into this name and we get Paduit-kha-en-nuit. And if people don't know the translation from the Aramaic, the original name of David, of course, was not David, it was Duad, is how it would be pronounced in Hebrew Aramaic. And so we have an exact transliteration between this particular pharaoh and King David. And his ancestors sound very much like the ancestors of King David. And it doesn't stop there, of course. What I like with this research is I don't compare, some people have compared David, I think, with Tutmosis III or something. But literally you get, a couple of comparisons. This is more than a dozen, probably 20 different comparisons, which all point in the same direction. So what I'm saying here is that the United Monarchy was not based in Jerusalem. That's why we cannot find it in Jerusalem. It was based in Tanis, which was the home of these particular pharaohs.
In Egypt.
In Egypt. But of course, Tanis has the same name as Jerusalem. Jerusalem was called, I'm trying to remember now. Jerusalem was called Zion. And Tanis is called Zoan. Zion, Zoan, in without vowels in the Aramaic, it's pretty much the same name. So they live in a city which has the same name. And the courtiers and the daughters and everything of this particular family are suspiciously the same. So we have the daughter of King David was called Makah-tamar, the famous Makah-tamar. And the daughter of this pharaoh was called Makara-mut-tamhat. Makara-mut-tamhat, Makah-tamar. Is that not the same name? And it's a complex name. It's not just Sue or Jane or something. Makara-mut-tamhat and Makah-tamar. Is that not the same name?
Hmm.
Okay. Well, what about some of the other characters of this united monarchy? Well, the army commander for King David was called Joab, fairly famous from the Old Testament. And the army commander for this particular pharaoh was called Joab-en-jed. Joab? Joab? It's the same name. Okay, they've just taken one section of the full title, but like in the modern era, no doubt everybody had a nickname, and so Joab-en-jed was Joab. Hi, Joe.
Hmm.
It's the
It's
same name.
crazy. It's like the evidence just keeps stacking and stacking and
It
stacking to the
keeps
point where
stacking up.
you look at one of them and you say, well, you're making too much of it, but then you're like, okay, like you said, you're talking at this point about a dozen or so things that
Yes,
just you can't keep ignoring it. Eventually it's if you ignore it, you're basically doing that, you're showing your bias against having an
yes,
open mind.
absolutely. And also, if I was not on a true seam of history, if this was me trying to force the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together, the names would not fit. But for them all to come out of the woodwork, and of course, I don't do this over one day. I'm doing this over a matter of weeks, and then you go, well, there's another one that's the same, and here's another one that's the same. And it all starts to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, and then you can be fairly sure you're on the right track, because evidence keeps coming out of the woodwork to say that you're on the right track.
Hmm.
The architect was the same as well. So the famous architect of King David and King Solomon, he was Hiram Abiff, wasn't he? Okay, we have a change here. I'm coming from a Masonic background. So in Masonry, he's called Hiram Abiff. And in the biblical story, he's called Hiram is my father. But my father is Abi. So his name in the biblical story is Hiram Abi. And in the Masonic world, it's Hiram Abiff.
When you
Okay.
say the Masonic world, what do you mean?
Masonic world, Masonry.
Okay.
The Masons. So the Masons have the same story, but they have it from a different source. So they have a different source of the Old Testament. It's slightly different.
I've not heard about this. Where do they get their story from?
Uh, I don't know. I've not ascertained.
Huh.
But the story that has come down through Masonry is pretty much it's all to do with the United Monarchy, because the history of Masonry is the building of the Temple of Solomon.
Hmm.
That is the prime foundation for all of Masonry. So all of this United Monarchy is a central part of Masonry. And they have a retelling which is probably an oral retelling for many, many centuries, has been very, very slightly different to the biblical story. But it's all to do with the building of the Temple of Solomon, and the main architect, who is Hiram Abiff, who was the architect from Lebanon. Actually, I disagree with that again, because again, you need to interpret the text properly. They say he came from Tyre, which is in modern Lebanon on the coast there. And he was the architect of King David and King Solomon. But of course, Tyre means stone. So of course the architect would have come from the quarries, the stones. We don't have to equate it with the city of Tyre here. I think they're talking about the quarries. He came from the quarries. And if we look at the quarries of King Solomon, King David, well, from my perspective, which were down in Egypt, the chief architect of this same pharaoh that we've been talking about, Paseba-kha-en-nuit, his chief architect was called Hiram-Saf. And that can be translated as Hiram Atif. Instead of Abif, Atif, Hiram Atif. And that's interesting from the Masonic world as well as the biblical world, because we don't know who this guy was. We don't even know what the name means. But of course, if we take it from the Egyptian, we know exactly what it means now, because in the Egyptian, we have the hieroglyphs, and that tells us what it means. And it's Heru Atif. Instead of Hiram Abif, Heru Atif, and it means Heru is Horus, and Atif. Atif is the same as Moses, basically. They had a lot of these names meaning son of. The same as we do in the modern world. You know, if you have a Mac in Scotland, Mac is the son of. MacDonald, Mac, you know, whatever, McKinnon. If you have an O in Ireland, O'Reilly, O whatever in Ireland, it's the same. It means the son of. So these are very traditional names that a lot of people had. And they had a lot of this in Egypt as well. So if you were Moses, you were the son of something, normally a god. If you were an Atif, again, you were the son of something. And he was the son of Heru, which is Horus. And he was the son of Horus, so he would have been identified with Horus, the hawk god. And so we have another exact correspondence between the two architects, the architect of King David and the architect of Paseba-kha-en-nuit, had the same name, was the same person. And so we end up with all of these similarities between these two people. And the easiest thing to say, either there was a correspondence. I mean, you could say that, you know, King David was just aping this particular pharaoh. But the much easier, if you are happy with changing the story slightly, the easiest thing to say is that King David was Paseba-kha-en-nuit. He was a pharaoh of Egypt. Now that explains the story, because now it explains where this capital city was. It explains how he had 400 chariots. It explains how he was the most powerful monarch in the region. Why did monarchs come from all over that area to come and see this powerful king called King David? Well, because he was the pharaoh of Egypt. That's why they came from all over the region to pay tribute. We have his city. We have his temple. You know, the famous temple. We have that. It's in Tennis, in northern Egypt. And the temple has the same name. It's in Aramaic, it's the Hetkar Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh. But in Egyptian, it's the Hetkar Ptah. It's the temple of Ptah. Note that temple in Aramaic and in Egyptian is the same word, Hetkar. Because, and here's a bit of another shocker, I'm not sure if we mentioned this. Aramaic, Hebrew, is Egyptian. It's the Egyptian language. It's the same. Why? Well, because they lived in Egypt for 400 years. What do you expect? Joseph, him of the coat of many colors, he was the prime minister of Egypt. He was the richest man in Egypt. He had a tribute of 20% of all of the taxes of Egypt went to Joseph. He was the richest person in the world. He lived in Egypt. He would have spoken Egyptian. Moses was supposed to be a prince of Egypt, even if you take the normal story. He was a prince of Egypt.
With the temple, with the temple thing, does that mean Ptah and Yahweh were equated?
Possibly, not necessarily. In fact, no. Ptah is the god of architects. hence masonry coming from, the Temple of Jerusalem. He was the god of architects. Yahweh is essentially the moon god. Yah in Egyptian means the moon. So you can be pretty sure that Yahweh is an aspect of the moon, while Elohim is an aspect of the sun. So you can see the religious dualism within Judaism. They will profess to be monotheist, but of course you've got Elohim, and then Yahweh, which are the sun and the moon. And then you've got Arden, because the Jewish god is called the Arden, which is the Aten of Akhenaten. Again, it's the sun god. And then you've got Shaddai, who is obviously an aspect. Shaddai is the storm god of the Jews, who's obviously an aspect of Seth, or Set, who became the Judaic Satan. He was the god of war and storms and so on.
I recognize the word Aten too. You mentioned that was related to the Garden of Eden, correct?
Yes, the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Aten. And the god called the Aten. Well, the Judaic god was called the Arden. It had the same name. So we can see a connection with Akhenaten there, pure and simple. Otherwise, their gods wouldn't have had the same name. And Ptah is interesting because Ptah can be linked to stone because he's the god of architects. And of course, and I've not been through this, I've not looked at the etymology of this in any great detail, but of course, when we came up into the Greek, the word they use for stone is Peter. Ptah, Peter, and then of course the first disciple of Jesus becomes Peter the stone. He is linked to Ptah, of course. It's the same religion, just been translated down through the years, down through the centuries, and through the different languages and religions. But coming back to Aramaic, I wrote a dictionary of Aramaic Egyptian dictionary, and there are hundreds of words that are identical. And I came across this wonderful book. It's a textbook, of course, for theology and for history, saying, how did it word it? I think the title of the book was Hebrew Words Adopted into Egyptian. And you're looking at this and thinking, hold on a minute, that's the wrong way round. Who was the dominant civilization here? A couple of Israelites or the whole of the Egyptian nation? Of course, if you're immigrants into a nation, like immigrants into America or Britain, you adopt the language of the land. And that's what everyone has always done. That's what they do today. And so even if the Israelites had a completely different language, it would have been a Semitic language, of course, before they had gone down into Egypt, they would have spoken Egyptian. And their language would have become infused with Egyptian terms. And that's exactly what happened. And all of their leaders would have spoken Egyptian because, as we've said, Joseph was the prime minister, Moses was a prince of Egypt. And now I'm saying that, hold on a minute, the whole of the United Monarchy here was Egyptian. They would have all spoken Egyptian as well. So what language do you think the Israelites spoke? They spoke Egyptian, of course. And so modern Aramaic and modern Hebrew is a daughter language of Egyptian. It's the same language. Even if you hear it, it has that same old staccato sort of sound to it that Egyptian has. And from that, you can actually decipher, you can decipher a lot of Egyptian, but also what I tried to do with it was make more sense of the Genesis story. Because you can read it in the Hebrew, and if you can equate the words with the equivalent Egyptian words, it can give a very slight different meaning to the story. So that's another interesting thing you can do with that.
So if we know who David is, then I guess that does lead us to King Solomon's identity, correct?
Yes,
This is fascinating. I love
that
this, getting this context behind it all.
that leads us on to Solomon, and it leads us on to the Queen of Sheba as well. And that's an interesting thing. So yeah, Solomon. Well, the next pharaoh on from Paseba-kha-en-nuit, and this was a problem that I mulled over for some time on this. The next pharaoh is Sheshonk, Shishak from the Bible. And here, for the first time in the Bible, we get a mention of a pharaoh. Shishak, who is Sheshonk, came up and destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem. Well, he didn't destroy it. He laid siege to it and took all of the treasures from the Temple of Jerusalem. And Sheshonk is Solomon. He is the son of Paseba-kha-en-nuit. And of course, the immediate problem is, hold on a minute, you can't have Solomon attacking his own city, his own temple. It doesn't match. Your story must be wrong, because it's disjointed. And I thought about this for some time, and of course read it and reread it, and of course that's not exactly what it says. Remember, we had the united monarchy, which ended with Solomon, and then became the divided monarchy when it was divided between his sons and one of them who may have been a son, may not have been a son. It became the divided monarchy. And so this does work with Solomon being Sheshonk, Shishak, if there had been a co-regency. So you tend to have this great assumption that because two new kings had taken over the united monarchy, that the king was dead, that Solomon was dead. But who said he was dead? We know from Egyptian history that quite often we had co-regencies. Akhenaten had at least a 7-year co-regency with his father Amenhotep III. So what if Solomon had a co-regency with his sons who took over during the united monarchy? So the scenario is, and the scenario does fit, that having completed the Temple of Jerusalem, which was not, it was the Hetkar-Ptah, which was in Zion. Sorry, it was in Zoan, not Zion. So the temple itself was in Tanis. Tanis, for those who are not familiar, if you go up to northern Egypt through the Nile Delta towards the Mediterranean, Tanis is almost on the Mediterranean coast, heading up towards Israel on the eastern side. And they built a new capital city there. The old capital city that we were talking about before, Avaris, Pyramisi, is just south of that. But the thinking is that the branch of the Nile that it was situated on silted up. And so they no longer had a river running through that city. So they rebuilt the city further north at Tanis, and they dragged all of the material from Pyramisi, from Avaris, and took it up to Tanis and reassembled a completely new city there. So it was a bit, again, like the United Monarchy story. It was a completely new city. And when people first got there, they thought, this is the city of Ramesses II, because all of the columns had Ramesses II written on them. But of course it wasn't. All of the columns have been taken from Avaris down the road. And they built this new city, and they built this new temple. In fact, there was 2 big temples there, the big temple and the small temple. And one of them would have been the temple of Zoan, the temple of Zion. So if Sheshonk had retired, because remember, there was still a battle in Egypt at the time. So rather like the biblical story, Egypt was divided, and the northern 21st dynasty of Paseba-kha-en-nuit and Sheshonq were fighting the southern Egyptians. So Egypt was divided. There was a civil war, as it were, going on at the time. And it wasn't until later in Sheshonq's reign that he managed to take over Thebes down in the south. So finally they persevered, they beat the southerners, and at last we get some engravings, some carvings being put down into Thebes that record the deeds of Sheshonq. So it's quite clear that later on in his reign, he might well have retired down south into Thebes, while the divided monarchy took over in the north of Egypt. And remember, when we're talking about this particular dynasty of Egypt, they controlled all of Israel as well. They controlled, so these pharaohs had been up, Sheshonq especially, had been up through Judea, through Israel, and taken over the whole of that region. So if someone wanted to say, well, Sheshonq was the king of Israel, well, he was, because he controlled the whole of that region. And then later on, of course, in the divided monarchy, Israel and Judea got separated between the two kings. And so we could have a situation where Sheshonq had retired down to Thebes, while the two sons were ruling up in the north, one perhaps in the Nile Delta, one perhaps up in Judea and Israel. And they managed to start a war between each other. Again, this comes from the biblical text. They started having a dispute and a war between each other. And so my argument is that Sheshonq, the Solomon character, fed up with these two bickering sons, just strolled up to Tanis, went to the gates of the city, as it says in the biblical text, and said, "Open the gates." And they did. That's what it says. He didn't have to lay siege to this city. He just ordered them to open the gates, and they did open the gates. He went into the city. He took out his treasures, all of his golden shields he had made for the temple and all of that, and just took them back down south, back down to Thebes. And so the biblical story does match what actually happened in Tanis at that time.
Amazing.
And it fits the whole of the story, and it can tell us so much more about the rest of the historical story and biblical story that has laid unknown and unexplained for centuries. For instance, it explains King Solomon's mines. I discovered King Solomon's mines because you cannot see where they are unless you understand the story. Unfortunately, they're all empty, so I didn't come out with any great riches. But the story of King Solomon's mines, again, it's not overtly biblical, but it's another extra biblical story that's come down through the millennia to us, was that King Solomon discovered these great gold mines down in the south. And that was the source of his wealth.
So you actually went into mines that are what that's referring to?
Because, I mean, the interesting thing about even the name of it is it's King Solomon's mines, plural. Why is it in the plural, not in the singular? Why is there more than one? And where was it? Okay, he was supposed to be in Jerusalem going south, so it's obviously south within Africa or something. In my new story, he's up in Tanis in the Nile Delta. Again, it's heading south somewhere. Where would these mines be? Gold mines. Egypt had a reasonable amount of gold, but it didn't have any really famous gold mines as such. But if we now know the context of this story, and this context of this story is now the 21st dynasty of Egypt, now we know where the mines are. Because, as I said before, Egypt was divided. There was a civil war going on between the northerners and the priest kings in the south. And what was happening is that the northerners were taking tribute from the southerners, demanding tribute every year from the south. Now, the South didn't have enough money to give the Northerners, and they had to pay this tribute every year. So what did they do? They started robbing the tombs of the 18th dynasty kings. And we have this from real history. At this very moment in time, people started robbing the tombs. And they have this court case. There was actually a court case of people found robbing the tombs down in Thebes, in the Valley of the Kings. And it's quite obvious, even if you read the court case in Egypt, I mean, we're talking 1000 BC here, 950 BC, whatever, that this was sanctioned at a high level. And it's pretty obvious that in order to pay the tribute to the Northerners at a high level, not admitting it to their own population, perhaps, they had started robbing the tombs of the pharaohs, of the 18th dynasty pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings. And that's how they were paying the tribute. And they were paying the tribute to Sheshonq, to King Solomon. And these were King Solomon's mines. That's where they were getting the gold from. And we know they were getting the gold from there because if you look at the artifacts that were found in Tanis, the artifacts came from the 18th dynasty, the tombs of the 18th dynasty kings. So we know that they were robbing the tombs of the kings in this era. And these so cool. are King Solomon's mines. Again, the story gets lost in the translation if you don't know what they're talking about. So if someone talks about King Solomon's mines, you think about this rough-hewn passage going down deep into the earth, taking out little ingots of gold. Well, nearly, but not quite. It was a very smooth-lined passageway going down beneath the mountain, which was a tomb of the earlier kings of Egypt in the Valley of the Kings, and they were robbing these tombs in order to pay tribute to the Northerners. And that's where the Northerners got all their wealth from. And that's why the tombs of the pharaohs are mostly empty, because they were all robbed, officially robbed by the establishment in Thebes at that time. And that's why they had to gather up all of these mummies. I don't know if you've heard about the cache behind the temple of Hatshepsut.
No.
They found a cache because a lot of these tombs have all been robbed. And about 100 years ago or so, they found a cavern behind the tomb, or rather the temple of Hatshepsut. And it was full of sarcophagi. And these were all, and they were all named. Someone had put little pieces of paper on each one, naming each of the pharaohs of Egypt who had been moved into this cache to obviously save them from being destroyed. And they were all in this room. I'm trying to remember how many there were. There was over 35 of them, all of the pharaohs of Egypt just stacked away in this room. That's what they did with them. They took all the gold, they took out the sarcophagi and saved the sarcophagi in this secret location, and gave all of the gold and the silver and the gems and the jewels up to the pharaohs in the north. And that's where the wealth of King Solomon's mines went to, and that's where the wealth of the 18th dynasty pharaohs went. So it all went up to the north, and from there it's been scattered to the four winds because it wasn't in Tanis, of course.
So is it fair to call Solomon a thief, basically?
Oh yeah, I mean, but this is what they did all the time. If you were the controlling authority, you took tribute. I don't know how we've managed to reverse that, where in the modern world, you know, nations like America and Europe give tribute to smaller nations in order to keep them quiet. I don't know where that's ever come from. In the old days, it was the small nations always gave tribute to the more powerful nations, and they were keeping that tradition. And from that, the North was very wealthy and very powerful, just as it says in the biblical record. This is where the wealth of King Solomon and King David came from. They were taking the wealth from southern Egypt. And yeah, that's how they became so powerful. And they used a lot of that because the tombs and the mummies of these kings were found. You might not know about that because, well, firstly, it happened on the eve of the First World War, so that sort of got in the way of any excavations. But secondly, these particular kings have been relegated to the second tier of pharaonic discoveries. But if you look at what was actually discovered, I think it's actually more impressive than the tomb of Tutankhamun. And yet, if you went to the old, I've not been to the new museum, they've just created a new museum in Cairo. But in the old museum, down one end of the corridor was the artifacts from the tomb of Tutankhamun. And there was, 100 people milling around and all these big lights and so on. Down the other end of the corridor, there were no lights. And that was the tombs of the Tanis dynasty. And I wanted to take some photos. And I couldn't even take a photo because there were no lights there. So I had to go to one of the curators of the museum, and I dragged out a curator with a wander lamp because I couldn't take any photos, and a set of steps and so on. And very nicely, he came out and helped me with this big 100-watt lamp so I could take some photos because it was all in darkness. And yet the sarcophagi of these kings are some of the finest sarcophagi ever found in Egypt. They are pure silver. And silver at this time was actually very valuable. It was probably more valuable than gold. And we have a solid silver sarcophagus of Paseba-kha-en-nuit, and we have a solid silver Horus sarcophagus, probably of Sheshonq. It might have been his son, but anyway, it says Sheshonq on it. And yeah, and all of the artifacts in pure gold and so on. It's just wonderful.
So David and Solomon were actually historical people, just not who we thought they were.
Yes, because the entire history of the 21st dynasty matches very well the United Monarchy. And now it explains all of the aspects of the United Monarchy that we didn't understand. Like, why can't we find any evidence for it in Israel? Well, because it was in Tanis.
That's awesome.
Why were they so powerful when there was no such power within Israel? Well, because the power was held in Tanis at the time. And the story matches all the way through. It matches all the way through. And this is why I was disappointed with Finkelstein when I presented this information to him. And he said, well, just because all of the names are the same doesn't mean we're talking about the same people. I think it's a good clue. If all the names of the people are the same, I think we're on to something here.
Especially when nothing else matches up.
Well, everything else seems to match up as well. The entire
in terms of the traditional story, it doesn't match up. If they're like,
oh yes,
everything else is a dead end.
Yep.
Then and you've got all these similarities. Like you can't just, unless you have a really good other hypothesis that has really good evidence, why not go where the evidence takes you?
Yeah, well, it changes the story again. Again, it means that the Israelites, the later Israelites now, we're talking 950 BC, were still Egyptians. They spoke Egyptian. They revered the Egyptian gods. Slightly different to the Theban Egyptians, they concentrated more on Sekhmet and on Seth, who was the war god, the god more of destruction, the sort of Shaddai type god. So there was a slightly different emphasis on the gods that they venerated, but they were still polytheistic and revered the Egyptian culture and theology.
Can I
and
ask?
their
Okay.
tombs are, well, they're all still there. You can go and see them. I went to see them up in Tanis. Nobody goes to Tanis. It's a wonderful site, actually, because nobody goes there. It's in the middle of nowhere. So I had a hotel in Zagazig, which is in sort of central Delta lands, and it still took 2 hours drive to get up to Tanis. And I was the only person there
Hmm.
for 2 days. I was the only foreigner. So it's dressed up as a museum. You know, there's a ticket office, and you pay your 10 pence or whatever it is, and you go in. But I was the only person there for 2 days.
That's
So it's
amazing.
a wonderful site. There's a lot to see. There's some really fantastic pillars, which I say are pre-dynastic. Uh, well, they go back into the Old Kingdom at the very least, maybe pre-dynastic,
Hmm.
because they are fantastic pillars, all made in granite, very, very difficult to make, very, very finely carved. And you can see where at the top of them, Ramesses II and some of the Tanis kings have put their cartouches in the top. But it's quite obvious that these pillars were made without any engravings on them, because the new engraving goes into the pattern that is on the top of. I mean, no one would make a pillar like that with all this delicate work on the top of the pillar and then stick a big cartouche across the top of it. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So they are old pillars which have been taken. They're all of from Aswan granite. So they've come up from the south of Egypt. They were at Avaris during the Hyksos era, and then they were taken up to Tanis and used in Tanis. So they've
Hmm.
been reused on several occasions. And I think they go back into antiquity, into a pre-dynastic Egypt.
Hmm. With all
So a lot
the
to see.
talk about the gold and the wealth, it does bring up the topic of the Queen of Sheba. She obviously in the biblical
Yes.
story came to see this great wealth. How does she play into this in actual history?
Yeah. Well, here's why you would want to cover this up, because all of this became an embarrassment um, to the rabbis. They didn't want you to know they were polytheistic. They didn't want you to know they were Egyptians. Um, and the Queen of Sheba is one of these aspects, because she's not who you think she is.
Hmm.
Um, and we get this information not just from the biblical story, but a lot of it comes from the Kebra Nagast, which is the Ethiopian Bible. And they've preserved a separate tradition of the United Monarchy, because the Queen of Sheba is connected with the United Monarchy very, very clearly. Well, because she went up to see Solomon. So who is she? Well, there are a couple of aspects that tell us where she came from, because nobody knows where she came from. A lot of people say she will come from Ethiopia because of the Kebra Nagast, which is an Ethiopian Bible. A lot of people say she came from Saba because it has the same name, from the Sabaean population, which is in modern Yemen. Um, and she was called the Queen of the South. If you look into the New Testament, she was known as the Queen of the South. So we're talking about something towards the south. If you read the Kebra Nagast, though, it says that the kingdom of Ethiopia stretched from, I don't know, somewhere down in Ethiopia up to the Nile, up to the borders of Israel. And they were classing that as the kingdom of Ethiopia. Okay, so if you said you came from Ethiopia, the whole of Egypt to them was classed as being Ethiopia. And then we have a story about the princess of Egypt that came up to marry King David, yeah? So King David married an Egyptian princess, a daughter of Pharaoh. Now, this is very unusual because the Egyptian pharaohs never gave their daughters to marry foreign kings, ever. It was forbidden. It just didn't happen. It would happen the other way around, of course. They would happily take in daughters of any of the local kingdoms, but it never happened the other way around. So how did King David manage to marry Pharaoh's daughter? And who was she? Which Pharaoh? Again, as ever, they delete the name of the Pharaoh, so you don't know what we're talking about. Luckily, the Kebra Nagas gives us a name, and it was Makshara. Okay, well, now we've got an inkling as to who this daughter of Pharaoh was. She was Makara. And remember, one of the daughters of King David was called Makara. And this is where it gets complicated and why they would want to delete it. But it looks like King David married one of his daughters. And she came up from the south because she would have been a queen of the south. She would have been based in Thebes. There was obviously a political and marriage union between north and south, because remember, they were at a civil war against each other, and obviously you get political marriages in these sort of cases. So I'm guessing the mother came from Thebes in the south. And so the Pharaoh's daughter that married King David was probably his own daughter. Okay, well, let's think about that for a minute. So that was the Pharaoh's daughter that married King David. So who was the Queen of Sheba? Well, what does the name mean? It's the Queen of Sheba is star in Egyptian. She was the queen of the stars. Who was the famous Sheba that married King David? That was Bathsheba. Bathsheba means the daughter of Sheba. What was King David's name? In this new scenario, he was called Paseba-kha-en-nuit. So his name was Sheba. He was the star. He was the star in the city. Remember, but Paseba-kha-en-nuit means my star and my city, rises in my city. King David was the star. And his daughter was the daughter of the star, Bathsheba. And that's a problem. Because remember, Bathsheba married King David. A very young Bathsheba married a very old King David from the text. And so it's fairly obvious that King David married his daughter. Just as all of the Egyptian pharaohs used to. Akhenaten married 3 of his daughters. And many of the others did exactly the same. Cleopatra married both of her brothers. This was normal within the pharaonic dynasties. But you can imagine that in the biblical texts, they didn't really want to admit this, You can't have King David marrying his daughter. So they had to separate them off and show she is merely called Bathsheba, the daughter of Sheba. But what happens when she marries the king? She's called the daughter of Sheba. When she marries the king, she becomes the Queen of Sheba, because his name is Sheba. So Bathsheba is the Queen of Sheba. The daughter married the king and became the queen. She is the Queen of Sheba. And she would have had her own power base. As I say, the nation was split. She lived in the south. And she went back down into the south to take control of affairs in the south of Egypt, in Thebes. And all of this fits together because we have all of the dates from the Kebra Nagast, and it gives all of the dates of when she went back down into Egypt, into southern Egypt, and when she came back up again. And it just so happens that from this union between Bathsheba and King David, the offspring of this union was Solomon. So Bathsheba was the mother of King Solomon. So that's where Solomon came from. But she retires to the south, and when she comes back up to the north again, it just so happens to be 30 years later, according to the Kebra Nagast, which is when King Solomon would have been holding his said festival. So they had a regeneration festival after 30 years. And she came back to the north of Egypt at his said festival. And of course, she came back to the north as the Queen of Sheba, because that was her name. And that is again why they had to delete her from the record, because it's not given in the biblical story, but it is given in the Kebra Nagast that she had a union with King Solomon. And the fruit of that union was another son who was called Menelik. So Solomon and the Queen of Sheba had a son called Menelik. But they had to delete this, of course, from the biblical story, because this was a marriage between the Queen of Sheba and her son, King Solomon.
Mm.
And you can see that would cause problems in later eras. And so they deleted this story. And they changed it slightly and just said she was a queen of the south. But that scenario teased out of these two books fits all of the available data we have about these two characters. So yeah, the Queen of Sheba was a famous queen. I mean, there were no queens that had that sort of wealth down in Saba and down in Ethiopia at that time. The only place that she could be the queen of the south and have that sort of wealth and bring that sort of wealth up to the north was as a queen of Egypt, a queen of southern Egypt, bringing gold and incense up to the north of Egypt. And of course, we know where she got that gold from. She got it from the tombs of the 18th dynasty pharaohs that they were robbing at that time, and bringing it up as tribute to King Solomon, who was in the north. And that is the political story that the Bible is alluding to and won't quite tell you about.
Can I ask, as we look at this stuff, there's so many amazing details that come out, but one question that comes to my mind right away is how long transpired between when the actual real history occurred and when they began to recraft the narrative. Obviously, it probably wasn't within their lifetime, because people could have said, no, we know these people were alive. We've seen them. We know who this is. You can't trick us. But within a few generations, I would assume it begins to be a little bit more malleable. Who is starting to legendize it and change it and get afraid of a narrative that includes so much incest, basically. Yes. Obviously, the morality is changing, where incest is becoming less acceptable at some point. How much time are we talking about? Who's doing this, do you think?
This was all crafted in the Babylonian exile. So the Babylonian exile is a real event. It happened. The only difference in my scenario is that when the Babylonians came down, we're talking 6th century BC here. So about another 300 years later on, I suppose, from the United Monarchy story. When the Babylonians came down, they didn't just take over Israel, as the story gives it, but they must have taken over Tanis at the same time, because that is where this monarchy was situated. It was situated in Tanis. It was situated in Zoan, not Zion. And so they came down because there is actually a story about this. One of the later kings of this dynasty was boasting about all of the wealth they had in this city, which was a bit of a silly thing to do, really. We've got all these tons and tons of gold, And so the Babylonians came down and took it all. So at the same time as invading Israel, Judea, they invaded northern Egypt and came and sacked Tanis and took these people into exile in Babylon. So, and that's the Babylonian exile as per the biblical story, and that's correct. So now they were stuck as prisoners working in Babylon, in Persia, for the Persians. And that's when they started crafting all of these stories. So it was a real lament for the good times back in Egypt. And now is the time that they started to demonize Egypt. Oh, Egypt was, the source of all of our woes and worries and all our tribulations. It all came from Egypt, and they started to demonize Egypt. And that is the time, I think, when they sort of codified a new history, a new morality, a new religion. It became more monotheistic, of course, because they had been polytheistic, even though, of course, Akhenaten was the first of the monotheists. So they had a strand of monotheism that had come through from Akhenaten. But they crafted all of these works as they did the Babylonian Talmud later on in the first, to fourth centuries AD. They crafted a lot of this story out during the Babylonian exile. But that didn't last too long because they were allowed back only about 40 years later. So another king came down into Babylon. Was it one of the Darius kings? I can't quite remember just for the minute. And released them and said, well, you can go back if you want. Well, half of them went back to where they had came from, and they might have at that point gone back more to Jerusalem than going back to Tanis. It's quite possible that the Egyptians, the southern Egyptians, wouldn't allow them back into Tanis. And the other half stayed in Persia because they'd done quite well out in Persia. And hence we get all of the Babylonian Jews who were very famous all the way through until they weren't kicked out of Persia until 1947. So there was a substantial Jewish element who ran all of the commerce in Iraq up until 1947. And at that point, they were all kicked out of what had been Persia, Iraq. And the last king of the Jews in Iraq was Naim Dangour, who didn't leave Iraq until about 1960. And he was kicked out of Iraq at that point, and he still has a claim against the Iraqis, although who he would claim against nowadays, I don't know. He had a claim in the 1990s for $26 billion worth of assets that were taken from him when he was kicked out of Iraq. And he fled to London. He went to London, of course.
Interesting.
So yeah, that was the length of time that the Jews had been in Persia.
With that time frame where you're saying that they began to become more monotheistic, I know that they had the Zoroastrian influence at that point from Persia and so forth. Do you think that was a major contributor, or do you think it was more just they internally decided to change their history as if their leadership made a collective decision? Do you think it was a slow evolution based on the other syncretisms going on? How do you think it evolved?
I think it was very much, best guess. It was very much a stop-start situation. There were a number of rabid priests around who were continually aiming for monotheism. But of course, remember that David and Solomon were not monotheists. They built temples to many gods, as it says in the Kings and Chronicles. And it's said that the Queen of Sheba took Solomon astray and led him away to all of these other gods. And that's why he was punished and he only lived 40 years instead of 80 years or whatever it was. This happened time and time again, all the way through the divided monarchy that followed. There were always people who were trying to take Israel back to monotheism. But remember, one of the Makatemas, because there was a famous line of these queens, was deposed and sent into exile, I think she was, for worshipping a if you read it in the English, it says an idol. And you think, well, why was she banished for worshipping an idol? And then you read it in the Aramaic, and it says something that I can't even pronounce. And you go, well, that doesn't make any sense. Then you read it in the Latin, if you go to the Vulgate, and it says she was worshipping a Priapus. And that doesn't mean anything unless you know your Roman history. Priapus was this godlet with this enormous great penis. So it was quite clear that she was worshipping a phallic symbol. And I think the phallic symbol was probably just actually a stela. In the front of every temple of Egypt, there would be two columns. And effectively, they are phallic symbols. So the tombs in Upper Egypt were a bit like the tombs we have in Ireland and places like that, the New Grange tombs, which are wombs of Mother Earth. So we have this big womb, this chamber with this shaft that goes up to it, which is illuminated at the winter solstice or the summer solstice. And the tombs down in Egypt were very much the same. They were uterine tombs where the sun could come down the sacred passageway down to the center of the tomb on certain days. And at the front of these tombs, you would have two pillars, which is the opposite, which is the male phallus. And up in Lower Egypt, they had quite a number of these. They called them gnomons because you can use them just like a sundial. And you can chart, of course, the movement of the sun and the movement of the moon with these great gnomons. But they were all phallic symbols as well. So it's probably quite possible that she was just venerating a very large obelisk. And you do in America still today. Of course, nobody will admit it, because again, you can gloss over these things and people don't realize what they're doing. But what is the Washington Monument?
Yeah.
The Washington Monument is a huge, great phallus. And especially when they put, there was a celebration down there. I had a wonderful photo of it, actually. They had a celebration of Venus at the bottom of it. You think, well, hold on. Yes, Venus and the phallus. Yes, we know where that came from. So anyway, the Queen of Israel at the time, this is during the divided monarchy, was deposed for venerating some sort of big obelisk, some sort of phallic symbol. And we have the same with the mad priest Jeremiah during the book of Jeremiah, if you remember that one. This was during the exile from Jerusalem, or as it would have been under my estimation from Zoan, when they were kicked out of Jerusalem, Egypt by the Babylonians. They'd been taken over by the Babylonians and they were being controlled by a Babylonian governor. And they had a rebellion against this governor and they actually kicked them out, which was probably not necessarily wise because, of course, the Babylonians came back again with another army to sack Jerusalem once more, and they fled. And where did they flee to? They fled to Egypt. So we had this great party of Israelites were going down into Egypt, being led by the mad priest Jeremiah. And Jeremiah, all the way down, was saying, well, this is your fault for being polytheistic. You've strayed from the commands of God. And the people on this exile were saying, no, when we worshipped the Queen of Heaven, everything was fine. It only got bad when we stopped worshipping the Queen of Heaven. Okay, so who's the Queen of Heaven? She is the Queen of Sheba, the Queen of the Stars. Who is the Queen of Sheba? Well, she's an incarnation of Isis, the Egyptian Isis. So it's quite obvious that, and this is fairly late, this is 6th, 7th century BC, that the Israelites were still worshipping Isis. And that's what it says in the book of Jeremiah. So they were never fully monotheistic all the way up until that era, and only started becoming monotheistic after that time. So it's quite late, in the history of Israel.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff.
So yeah, this is just a quick addition to the similarities we were discussing between King Solomon and the history of the 21st dynasty, so Paseba-kha-en-nuit. His army commander was called Joab, as we've seen, Joab-en-jet. And the army commander of King Solomon was called Joab. Now, the army commander of King David was known as the captain of hundreds and thousands. So he was an army commander over quite a large army of hundreds and thousands. And the Egyptian equivalent now tells us why this is pertinent, why this has been translated as such within the biblical story. Because Joab in the Egyptian means 10,000. It is the name that means 10,000. So not only do the names sort of agree between these two, they're both called Joab, but the attributes of that name are the same as well. So the biblical Joab was the captain of hundreds and thousands, and the Egyptian Joab, his name means 10,000, the commander of 10,000. So it's identical. Yeah, it just
like the
all
onion
of
just
these
keeps
things
peeling back.
Yeah, all of these things keep popping up, and I haven't been over the Solomon book for quite some time, so I've forgotten quite a lot of it. But there are lots of these little asides which all point back to the same story, and I'm continually amazed sometimes when I read these books, because I might not read them for several years, and I go back through the story looking something up, and I'm thinking, God, that's good. Who wrote this? Oh, it was me, wasn't it? Yeah. Because there's all these little bits that I've forgotten, and I can't, I don't even remember that I've written these things in these books sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, they all point back to the same conclusion. So yeah, it's all good stuff if you have the time to go through the books, because they can be a bit heavy, but they're very informative.
Yeah. I love it. I'm looking forward to going through myself. I do want to ask, while we're still on this topic of Egypt, first, the question of Mount Sinai. Where is that location? What's it referring to?
Well, here's another example of people covering things up, which we've alluded to all the way through this story, that there has been a deliberate cover-up. How on earth did the Israelites lose their most important mountain? It's not possible, is it? I mean, these people were assiduous record keepers. They wrote everything down. We have every name of every king, pauper, prostitute. They're all named somewhere in the Old Testament. And then they forget where their sacred mountain was? It's not possible. Not possible. So what's happened here? Again, this is the removal of this story from its original roots, because its original roots were too embarrassing to the new monotheistic, solely Israelite rabbis and theologians. They wanted to divorce themselves from their original Egyptian roots, from their polytheism, from their connections with Egypt, because it no longer suited their religion. And Mount Sinai was one of those things they had to delete. And they did. So we can find Mount Sinai if we look at its attributes. So what was Mount Sinai? Well, it was the sacred mountain of the Israelites. It was where God lived. I mean, how can they forget where God lived, for goodness sake? It had a cave inside it where God lived. It was sharp and it was difficult to climb. It was on the edge of a desert. It was the highest mountain in the region, but it was small enough that you could cordon it off because you weren't allowed to touch it, which rather suggests that it was a mountain that sort of springs out from a flat ground sort of thing. If you can put a fence around it and you're not allowed to touch it. At the bottom, there was a pavement at the bottom of it, which was black or dark, and it looked like the night sky, highly polished. Well, that's an odd set of attributes to a sacred mountain. Where can we find such a structure? Well, we'll come back to that lacuna that we were looking at before, that there are certain things missing from the biblical record. And one of those things is if you go into a computer Bible and you type in pyramid, it will search through the entire Bible and it will say, nothing found. How can that be? Joseph was the high priest of Heliopolis. He was the prime minister of Egypt. Heliopolis is an arrow's arc away from Giza. Are you telling me that Joseph never went to the Giza pyramids and spent an afternoon on the Giza plateau having a cup of tea? It's not possible, is it? How on earth did they spend 400 years in Egypt and never mention the pyramids? At a time when people lived in mud huts or very, very small one, possibly two-story homes, and this thing is 153 meters into the sky. And they never mentioned the Great Pyramid? Well, now we've found our Mount Sinai, haven't we? Let's look at what the Great Pyramid is. The Great Pyramid is the mountain of God. It has a cave inside it where God lived. Because it wasn't a tomb. We'll go through this in a minute. None of the pyramids were tombs. It's sharp and it's difficult to climb. It's the tallest mountain in the region, but it's small enough that you can put a fence around it because the people are not allowed to touch it. And if you go to the eastern side of the Great Pyramid, there is a pavement made of black basalt, highly polished, that looks like the night sky. Mount Sinai is the Great Pyramid. And that's why they can't admit where it is, because it's sitting there in full view. But they daren't say that their prized mountain of God is the Great Pyramid because it changes the entire basis of their religion. It admits they're Egyptian. It admits that they were polytheistic. It admits that they lived in Egypt. And it changes the religion so substantially they cannot admit where their sacred mountain is. And that explains why there were so many of these sacred mountains. It wasn't just Sinai. There was Mount Seir, there's Mount Hor. It explains why they were circling these pyramids. Because on the Exodus, they didn't just visit Mount Sinai. And of course, Moses climbed up Mount Sinai. I say that on the exterior of these pyramids, there used to be steps. Of course, there's no steps now because all of the casing blocks have been taken off. And so we have no idea of how people used to climb up there. But we know people used to climb up to the entrance to the Great Pyramid because we have a text from Strabo, which is like 1st, 2nd century BC, who describes the entrance to the Great Pyramid and that it was always open. So yeah, people went up to the entrance of the Great Pyramid even back 2nd century BC. And I say there was a set of steps that went up the casing blocks, and so you could visit it. But it was steep and difficult to climb. I mean, if you've ever been to the pyramids, you'll know that. And they were circling the pyramids because this was a part of Egyptian theology, which has been preserved in other places. So your listeners will probably know that the Giza pyramids were linked to stars. Again, we're talking about the heavens, the cosmos, that all of these religions were sort of cosmic religions. And the three pyramids at Giza are representational of the belt of Orion. And I think that's fairly obvious, actually.
Yeah.
So they're representative of stars on Earth. But if you go down to Dashur, which is the next set of pyramids down the road, they seem to be arranged to be representative of the celestial pole and the ecliptic pole. And they don't have any obstructions around them. So you could circle those pyramids quite happily, as it says in the biblical text, where the Israelites were circling the sacred mountains. What did they call it? In the English translation, they say they were circumperambulating the mountains. It's good old Victorian English for you, isn't it? Why were they going round and round the mountains? And what mountains were they? Well, the mountains, in my view, were the pyramids down at Dashur, which are megalithic. They're very old pyramids down there. And the reason they were circling the pyramids is the same reason that Muslims still circle the Kaaba over in Mecca. It's the same branch of the same religion, and it's the same celebration that they're doing down there as well. And they used to do it down in Saba. We haven't talked about Saba, but these people we were talking about the book of Jeremiah and the mad priest. I say that these people eventually fled down to Saba, which is in modern Yemen. And down in Saba, they built what can only be described as a precursor to the great mosque at Mecca. It was a big circular enclosure where they used to circumperambulate the central object, whatever that was in the center.
Mm.
Why were they doing all of this circling rituals? Because it was symbolic of the movement of the stars. If you look up at the northern stars today, and especially if you see it in a time lapse, you will see all of the stars circulating in a big circle around the celestial pole. That's what they were recreating on Earth below. So we have this old Masonic adage, as above, so below. What happens in the heavens above is to be recreated on the earth below. And that's what they were doing at Dashur. That's what they were doing at Saba with their big circular temples. And that's still what they're doing today at Mecca. If you see all of the faithful in Mecca going around and round the Kaaba in Mecca, that's exactly what they're doing. They're recreating, they're all stars circling the celestial pole, which is the Kaaba in the center. Just don't tell Muslims that, because they'll all be upset because they've divorced themselves from their original stellar roots. But that's where it all came from.
I was going to add to the Lord's Prayer, on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah, just it's the same, as above, so below.
Yeah.
That's an old Masonic adage, that everything above is to be recreated on earth. And that's what these ancient civilizations did. And the pyramids are one of those aspects where they recreated the heavens above on earth.
Can I throw this totally curveball question? But I know that throughout some of the parts of the history that we're talking about, we're talking a lot about the political movements, the wars, the kings, some of the, maybe some of the priests that were starting to take power or starting to manipulate and influence the narrative of the whether it was polytheistic versus monotheistic. But one of the questions I have that comes up a lot is, we're talking about a culture that has obviously so many gods. You're talking endless Egyptian gods, some of them across all of Egypt for centuries and millennia. Some of them were popping up at times and kind of then drifting into oblivion. But all these gods, all these demigods, some gods, even connected to actual rulers, where it seems like they're an incarnation of the god over and over, and others is just like a temple you go to worship. But all these gods, and then eventually we know that when we move forward in time, we have the Greek gods and the Roman gods become part of the story. But right in between there, one of the most interesting aspects of this to me, and I admit I don't know as much as I want to yet, but you have the beginning teasers of the mystery cults where you have Pythagoras who goes down into Egypt and gets trained there. You have other people, and this sense of like there's a mystery that we're going to begin to initiate certain people into, but the regular people aren't going to get the full story until you've gone through the whole, the true initiation. And we know that you're definitely going to be accountable for the secrets that we're going to tell you, the secrets of the universe. Very esoteric and very, very cultish. Where does that begin to play into your mind in terms of the history that we've been talking about? When does that start to actually really have some meat behind it, as far as you're aware?
It's always been this way. And it was, Jesus was the head of a mystery cult. Unto you it's been given, but unto them it has not been given. That's why he spoke in parables. He was speaking on two levels on all occasions between his disciples and the laity. It was an initiatory mystery cult. The Nazarene were. Queen Helena had to spend 7 years of initiation before she became a Nazarene. So that was quite a long introduction into the Nazarene church. All the way back into Egypt, it was a mystery cult because knowledge is power. You're not going to give it away randomly, almost like we do today in our education system. We give a lot of this information away to almost anyone, which maybe not, well, it's probably good in terms of egalitarianism, but it diminishes your power because you've given away this information to everybody. And they used to keep it secret because knowledge is power. And that comes back to Mount Sinai again. That was a secret. And we know it was a secret that was kept at that time within the Israelites and later with Jesus, because they allude to it. All the way through these stories, we have the number 40. We have 40 years in the wilderness. Solomon and David, 40 years and 80 years reign length, or whatever it was. We have Jesus with 40 days and nights in the wilderness. There is a concentration on the number 40. If you look it up on a electronic Bible, it pops out time and time again. What did it imply? Why this special number 40? It is the Great Pyramid. It tells people, if you mention the number 40, if you say I'm 40 years old, if you say I've done a penance out in the wilderness for 40 days, it tells people that you've been instructed into the secrets of the Great Pyramid. Because the Great Pyramid is a 40 times copy of pi. So all of these pyramids were mathematical. Comes back to what Josephus Flavius was saying in his beginning of his Genesis, because he wrote his own Old Testament. In ancient days, there were 2 pillars made, one of brick and one of stone, and on them were inscribed the entire knowledge of mankind. That's the Great Pyramids. And the pyramids were all mathematical. So the Great Pyramid is a pi pyramid. The second pyramid is a 3-4-5 Pythagorean pyramid. The Red Pyramid at Dashur is a 20-21-29 Pythagorean pyramid. They understood some fairly deep mathematics. And the Great Pyramid, furthermore, is a circle. So that the maths it embodies in its shape is 2 pi r, 2 times pi times r, which is the formula for a circle. But pi, they've used the standard sort of 22/7 approximation of pi, because that way you can get whole numbers for the height and the perimeter length of the pyramid. So the base numbers are 22/7. But the dimensions of the pyramid are 280 and 440. It's 280 and 880. And the entire circumference is twice that, or 1,760. and that is a 40 times multiple of pi.
And
And
you mentioned
if you
one of them
know
is
that,
sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
You mentioned one of them is 153 feet. Is that right?
1,760 cubits.
Okay. Did you mention
around the
153
perimeter.
earlier?
No. Oh, that's in meters. Yeah, but I try not to use meters because that's not what they were using.
Okay.
So the height of the Great Pyramid is 156, I think it is, meters.
Gotcha.
I try not to use that because you cannot see the mathematical significance of the pyramids if you use the wrong units.
Right.
You've got to use the units that they were using, which was the royal cubit, which was the cubit of the Jews. The Israelites used the same cubit. And we know that because in one of the books, and I can't remember which one it was, they were discussing the dimensions of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. And they said that the cubit they were using was a cubit and one hand. And we know what that is. That was the royal cubit of Egypt, which was the cubit that was used for all of the pyramids. So the Israelites were using the same measurement system as the Egyptians. And if you use that measurement system to measure the pyramids, you will find that you end up with whole numbers, significant whole numbers for the height and the perimeter length of these pyramids that conform exactly to the 345, the 20, 21, 29 Pythagorean, and for 2 pi r. And we still use those measurements today. Did we go through this last time? I don't think we did we?
I don't think we did, no.
No. Why do we have imperial units? You still have them in America. We've sort of got rid of them in the UK quite a lot. Why do you have the imperial units? Why do you have such stupid units? So you have a rod which is 5.5 yards, a chain which is 22 yards, a furlong which is 220 yards, and then the mile. Where did all that come from? It came from the Great Pyramid. So the pyramid is 1,760 cubits around the base, to the nearest 4 centimeters. I mean, we're talking exact. And the mile is 1,760 yards. It's exactly the same as the perimeter length of the Great Pyramid, except we're using a different unit now. We're using yards instead of cubits. And the entire imperial system comes from there because it's all based on pi, the same as the Great Pyramid was based on pi. So the chain is 22 yards because pi is 22 over 7. The furlong is 220 because it's 10 times the denominator of pi. The stupid rod, which is 5.5, why would you ever have 5.5 units as a unit of measure? I mean, it's just crazy. Okay, well, it's a quarter of 22. It's a quarter of the 22 over 7, which is pi. That's where it was all derived from. It's all derived from pi, and it was all derived from pi because the Great Pyramid was based upon pi. So the invention of the imperial system, which goes back to 16th century Britain, it was created, they say, we're not entirely sure its entire history, but by Elizabethan England, was based on pi, and someone must have known at that time what, via tradition or via measurement, because Egypt was only just being opened up at that time. People were actually sailing over there and having a look at these monuments, more so a bit later than the Elizabethan era. But yeah, late Elizabethan era, they would have been there just about. They must have known that the Great Pyramid was 1,760 cubits around the base. Remember, this was a great interest in that era. People were interested. People disregard it now as being esoterica. You know, it's not proper science. You know, you can't investigate these things. But of course, back in that era, people did, and so one of Isaac Newton's less famous books was what did he call it? A dissertation upon the sacred cubit of the Jews and the cubits of other empires. So he was looking at the dimensions of the sacred cubit of the Jews, which we know today to be the royal cubit of Egypt. And so he did a big investigation into the cubits of many cultures, including Egypt. And as a part of that, he sent over, was it Robert? It was Graves, I think, was the guy that he sent over to Egypt to measure the Great Pyramid. And he was the first person to deduce that the king's chamber was a 10 by 20 cubit chamber. And he was the first person to measure the diameter and height of the Great Pyramid. And that was done specifically for Sir Isaac Newton, so he could write his dissertation on the cubit, because it was held to be sacred. There was something, there was something of interest here. And there is, if you understand that the Great Pyramid is a copy of the formula for a circle.
Yeah. I love too how with, you mentioned the 3, 4, 5 and Pythagoras.
Yes.
He's even woven right into John 21 with the 153 fish. And I'm fascinated by the idea that the Essenes were known as Pythagoreans, and just it's like this whole story just keeps on getting more fascinating to me.
Yeah, the 153 fish is interesting because I don't know if you know, it's a 17 pyramid.
Yeah.
So if you write starting with the number 1 and go 17 along the base and keep going upwards, you end up with 153. That was done for a reason. I'm not entirely sure why, but there was a later chap who did exactly the same. I don't know if you've been following the Shakespearean,
No.
What would you call it? Controversy. Shakespeare is not Shakespeare, which shows how you can hide something from history, even in the recent times. You can hide a person, an event from history, because there is a problem with Shakespeare, with the Stratford man, the classical Shakespeare. Shakespeare couldn't write. The only signatures we have demonstrate that he could not write. Both of his daughters were illiterate. In his will, he makes mention of no books, no library, no manuscripts. In his will. I mean, this is a guy who's been writing for his whole life, and he has no books. No manuscript has ever been found in his hand. No letter has ever been found in his hand. He was in London. His wife was up in Stratford. They never, ever wrote a letter to each other. And it goes on and on and on and on. The Stratford man is not William Shakespeare. There's no way he is. He was illiterate. Okay, well, that leaves us with a problem. If Shakespeare is not Shakespeare, then who is Shakespeare? Back in the 1920s, a very, very good case was made, and this has been evolved in recent years. By recent years, I mean in the last 20-15 years. A good argument has been made that Shakespeare was actually Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And he has lots of similarities with this Shakespeare-type character. He was the richest man in Britain. Again, we have a sort of similarity here with the Jesus character, where, suddenly this pauper prince of the literary sphere, the Stratford man, is now the richest man in England. He was a member of the royal court. He was a confidant, favorite of Elizabeth I. He was a consummate literarian. So he had his own playwrights and troupe of players. He had his own theaters. He wrote himself, and he was involved in this story because we have these problems again. The first folio of Shakespeare, which was written after his death, it was not very long, about 10 years after his death. But the first folio of the Shakespearean plays was dedicated to two earls. I think one was I can't remember where they were the earls of. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It was dedicated to two very important earls in the country who funded as well this manuscript, because books were very expensive in those days. You had to have someone, a patron, who was going to assist with it. And the Stratford man had no association whatsoever with these two earls. But the daughters of Edward de Vere were betrothed to both of these earls. Okay. The Sonnets, which was the first book that Shakespeare wrote, was dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. The Stratford man has no connection whatsoever with the Earl of Southampton. But the Earl of Southampton and Edward de Vere were brought up in the same house. They were brothers. And so we get all of these connections linking together that show that the classical interpretation is completely and utterly wrong. And it's being covered up. And if you can cover up something so recent, it's only like 400 years ago, if you can cover up something so recent, imagine what you can do when you're covering up the Old Testament or the New Testament. It is very easy for people to change the story. Why did he not want to be known? Because he was an earl. An earl was not supposed to be spending all his time writing plays. It was not a courtly thing to do. So it's not surprising that he would want to keep it secret. And other people have argued that the plays were propaganda for the Tudor dynasty. And again, it was probably better for them to have a commoner writing these propaganda plays rather than someone who was actually in the court at the time writing these propaganda plays about the rights of the Tudor dynasty. It was political. A lot of it was political. Elizabeth I and the Tudors trying to educate, the British people.
That's amazing.
Why does this come into this? We were talking about the number of fish. Why did I suddenly think of this? Because he does exactly the same. The sonnets, there's 153 sonnets. The last sonnet is duplicated. So the sonnets do exactly the same as the number of fish that Jesus has. They're both 153. Why did he do it? Why did the 17th Earl of Oxford do it? Well, because it's a 17 triangle. If you add up all of the numbers in a 17 triangle, and he was the 17th Earl, it comes to 153. It's a good indication that whoever wrote the sonnets was the 17th Earl of something. Yeah, there's lots of that numerology that occurs in these books, if you understand what the story is telling. And this is why these secret societies were so successful, because you could just give someone the nudge and the wink and say, 153. And suddenly it starts to make sense in so many of these cases. Same with the Great Pyramid, number 40. You don't need to know much, and people go, oh, yeah, no, now I understand. Yes, okay, brilliant. And that's how you can keep this information secret and hidden for hundreds of years. And it's done through these secret societies and these well, initiatory.
I know some of the depths of that will be maybe for another time, but just to maybe wrap that part of it up, I'm amazed at how people don't seem to be willing to open their eyes and just grasp the nuance here. It's number one, I know it's complex, and that's part of it. It's very difficult because there's a lot of work you have to do to understand it and pull the pieces out and put them back together the right way. when you're talking about Pythagoras, and all these other guys. But when you put it all together and you realize they're mixing things like sacred geometry and harmonics and a whole bunch of other things relating to literally music. They're equating music and all that Pythagoras did for that, and then all the other aspects of the cosmology, the stars, and even gematria. You add it all up, and you're just like, there is some pretty cool stuff here. And one of the things I've said a few times in my interviews is, when you actually come back to the Bible, like when you're in it, where you're like, all right, Yahweh's real. He demands blood magic. Jesus is my savior. He's the only way to heaven. When you're in it, and then you wake up, so to speak, you get out of the matrix, and you're like, you're so angry. You're like, this was such a bad thing that happened to me. I wasted my life on mythology. And you kind of get over your angry phase, and then you step away, and then you come across a few videos like yours or your books or other people doing similar things, and you say, huh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. And eventually you develop the mindset to say, this book actually is very interesting. The Bible is a very interesting book if you have the right, for lack of a better word, primer to understand how to interpret it. If you have a primer of a mindset, you can go back to it and say, yeah, there's some pretty cool stuff here. It's not what we thought it was, but that doesn't make it a stupid book. It just, you have to understand what it is. It is a piece of literature, and these people are characters in a story that was made up or adapted from history. And that's all it was. It wasn't some kind of divine book, but it was still very, very fascinating. And when you get into it and you get the nuance, like you said, with 40, 153, and of course you get to Revelation, and you're seeing, Pythagoras and all this stuff on steroids and gematria. Even like in Luke 2, I think it is, with Anna, the numbers of how long she was married and then widowed, and then she's, in the temple till she's 84, and you're like, these are Pythagorean numbers. You add it all up, and you're like, okay, there's a lot more here. And I love how, I don't know if you remember the movie, what is it called, Contact, with Jodie Foster, but where they get this signal from space, and all they're hearing is this noise. It's just, and she has this guy who comes in who's blind, so his hearing is much, much more attuned to nuance, and he's cranking the radio up. And everyone's like looking at him like, we've already heard this noise. We know what it sounds like. Why do we have to hear it louder? We can't even talk. And he's doing it because he hears this little, while it's doing this really loud, there's this little in the background, which is a video file. And he's like, there's a lot more here, guys. You think you see the picture because you hear this audio. There's a whole video file mixed in this. And then of course that brings them to the point where they can actually see the rest of the story. But that's what's happening here, is there's more to this. And when you get it, you get the big picture. If you ignore it, you kind of ignore it at your own peril. You're basically making up something that it's not historically picking up the real history, and it's not what the people that changed it meant. They didn't mean for you to come away from this with Christianity. They were doing something very, very, very different. And it's even something as simple as seeing the two Marys at the foot of the cross, the two Sophias. You're like, there's just so many levels here. And if you just read it, I think somebody, I forget who, said that reading things literally is like one of the lowest ways of reading these texts. Like you have to see the symbolism here. You have to.
Yeah, well, the people who are writing this were very proud and literate people. They were very proud of their art. And so they loved wordplay all the time, because that was their career. And they would play with words all the time. And I always imagine these people in the scriptoriums, especially first century, with Josephus and so on, rolling on the floor laughing, because the Romans who were in control had no idea what they were talking about. But they did, because they were in the know. And that was just writing the Talmud, let alone any esoterica within the mystery schools. That was just the Talmud. It's all written in code, every inch of it. On the surface, the Talmud is completely baffling, unless you know what the scribes, the rabbis, were actually talking about, because they changed names all over the place, and unless you know who they're talking about, it makes no sense.
Mm.
And so we get, people like Bar Kamsa and what else was he called? Basteda. Forget now. But Bar Kamsa, did we talk about the mosaic up in Israel? I don't think we did.
I don't think so.
It's another example of how things can be covered up. So up in Israel, very recently, we're talking only 5 years ago, they discovered a mosaic in a synagogue. And it was a mosaic of a king giving a calf to the high priest of Jerusalem. And the archaeologist on site, who would have been assisted by, I mean, she was an American Jew, but she would have been assisted by loads of people from Israel on this big archaeological site. And she said it was Alexander the Great giving a calf to the high priest of Jerusalem. Because Alexander the Great did meet on his way down into Egypt. He did meet with the high priest of Jerusalem. So she said it was Alexander the Great. And I'm looking at this thinking, are you stupid? And then I'm thinking, no, they've done this for cash because they sold this story to National Geographic. And National Geographic put it on as a front page spread and obviously donated quite a lot of money to the dig in order to carry on digging. And so it was quite profitable. But of course, National Geographic didn't want some odd name as being, who this character was. So they said it was Alexander the Great. Yeah, okay. So it's Alexander the Great with a beard and long hair, which he never wore, and with a Jewish side lock of hair. Yeah, Alexander the Great Jew. Yeah, sure, it's him. Complete and utter nonsense. It's Bar Kamsa. If you read the whole of this dig was run by Israelites, Israelis, modern Jews, and nobody in that dig had ever read the Talmud. There's a famous little passage, it's 2 pages actually, it's quite a lot, of the history of Bar Kamsa. And Bar Kamsa was the leader of the Jewish revolt. We came back to what we were talking about, where everything revolves around the Jewish revolt. But anyway, they call him Bar Kamsa, and that's just a pseudonym, of course. That's not his real name. And Bar Kamsa is agitating for the Jewish revolt. And so he takes a sacrificial calf from Emperor Nero. He marks it so it's impure and gives it as an offering to the high priest of Jerusalem, who's now put in an awkward position because this is a Gentile calf with a cut on its lip, which he's not allowed to accept. So he rejects it, upsets Nero, and basically here we have the start of the Jewish revolt, which was all caused by Bar Kamsa. And it's pretty obvious that Bar Kamsa is King Hyksos of Edessa, the guy we were talking about who is the biblical Jesus. So here is a very, very early image of the biblical Jesus, where he's called Bar Kamsa in the Talmud, because they're not going to tell you who it is, because otherwise they'll get strung up themselves. And so they've made up this name Bar Kamsa, which means the locust. And that's just a funny hyperchorism itself. It's another nickname. They used to call the Edessans the locusts, because in the eyes of the rabbis in Jerusalem, they were just as bad as the locusts of the plagues. Now, the locusts in the plagues during the exile, the Exodus, they came out of the east and they destroyed Egypt. And of course, this Persian family, the Edessan family of King Hyksos, they came out of the east and they destroyed Jerusalem. The end result of their reign, their short reign there, was the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And so they called them locusts. And that's why he's called Bar-Kamsa, the son of the locust. And here is this wonderful zodiac of Bar-Kamsa, of this very event, who I say, you don't even need to know that for it to be very significant. But I say that this is an image of, a very early image of the biblical Jesus. And none of the archaeologists and historians and theologians on the dig site knew anything about it. I wrote to the chief archaeologist, and she wrote back and said, well, we can all have our opinions. She didn't accept any of it. But here is a very significant piece of imagery, because we have an image of Bar-Kamsa, who I say is the biblical Jesus, with ginger hair, which is what I said 10 years ago or more, that he has to be ginger, because all of these pharaohs and people were ginger. Ramesses II was ginger. Cleopatra was ginger. I say that he was descended from Queen Cleopatra, that this was the ginger dynasty. All of these pharaohs were ginger. Yuya was ginger, the father of the Amana dynasty, he was ginger. And here we have this ginger character offering this calf to the high priest of Jerusalem. And he's got long hair, long beard, and a Jewish payot, a Jewish side lock of hair. Who were the Nazarene? The Nazarene had long hair. This is why Jesus is always portrayed with long hair and a beard in classical. And you still get people even today saying, oh, that's not how he would have been. He would have been more like the Romans, clean shaven. No, the Nazarene, and Jesus is clearly called a Nazarene, were not allowed to cut their hair. And so he would have had long hair and a beard. And if you go up into Edessa, which is where I say they came from, all of the Edessan monarchy had long hair and a beard, because they were Nazarene. And you get people in high positions in universities, in academia, who don't know this and get rather curt in their replies when I say, sorry, you've got it wrong. It's got nothing to do with Alexander the Great. This is an image of Bar-Kamsa. I didn't even introduce the complexities of Jesus into this, because that was just going 2 steps too far. I just said, look, this is Bar-Kamsa. Have you ever read, the Talmud? And I gave her the extract from the Talmud, and she had no idea. No idea.
It brings up the need for people to be really, really thoroughly educated in this stuff. If you truly, if it's a passion of yours to really understand the origins of Christianity, you have to be a student. You have to.
Yeah. You have to be a polymath as well. People are too specialist on occasion.
Yeah.
The theologians know very little about history, and the historians know very little about theology. And unless you know the two together, you're going to be stuck.
Yeah. So while we're on the topic of Egypt, could I ask a final question about Egypt, and then we'll move to a different topic to close out our time. But the Egyptian false prophet, what is that? Could you give a little context to what that is and what that refers to?
Yes, we have this character who's mentioned in both the works of Josephus and in Acts of the Apostles, called the Egyptian false prophet. And he is around at the same time as not the classical Jesus, but certainly the classical Saul. And nobody sort of knows who he is. However, we have a couple of instances of what the Egyptian false prophet did. And the first one is he fed the 5,000. Okay, well, that might give us the clue as to who this guy was. It was the Egyptian false prophet who took the 5,000 out into the wilderness. Okay, well, that sounds rather biblical. And then what else did he do? Oh, he had the meeting on the Mount of Olives, which was disrupted by the Roman guard. Okay, so we have this famous instance in the biblical text where Jesus and his disciples are having this night meeting for some reason on the Mount of Olives, and they're captured by the Roman guard, and that was when Jesus was taken off. Okay, well, we have the same story from real history. But in real history, it was the Egyptian false prophet. And he wasn't there with his disciples. He was there with 36,000 soldiers ready to storm Jerusalem. And again, they were surprised by the Roman guard, and the army scattered to the four winds. And in this case, it says the Egyptian false prophet melted away into the darkness. So he escaped. So there's a slight difference there in the story. But it's pretty clear from these two instances that the Egyptian false prophet was Jesus himself. Remember, Peter was mistaken for the Egyptian false prophet. So it's concurrent with these events in this era. Someone thought Peter was the Egyptian false prophet when they were looking for Jesus. So it's obviously got something to do with the gospel story. And remember, Jesus came out of Egypt. Out of Egypt I have called my son. He went to Egypt for his education, never mind for his safety. He went there for his youth. And of course, as a prince of the region, which he was, even by the admission of the New Testament itself, as a prince, he would have gone to Egypt. That's where you go for your education. If you want a good education, we've just been talking about the secrets and the mystery schools of Egypt and all the knowledge they have of mathematics and so on, which were all embodied in the monuments there, but also embodied within the library at Alexandria. If you wanted any decent education, then you went to Egypt. Out of Egypt I have called my son. And if you look into the Talmud, it was said that Jesus brought out of Egypt, when he came out of Egypt, he brought out the sacred name of God tattooed on his thigh, which he wasn't supposed to bring, out of Egypt. And so who is the Egyptian false prophet? It has to be a reference to Jesus himself. But of course, they can't admit that because A, it links him too strongly with Egypt itself. B, we have this historical account of the storming of this army on the Mount of Olives, ready to storm Jerusalem, which was disturbed by the Roman guard, and that's in real history. They had to separate the Egyptian false prophet from Jesus. And also he's called a false prophet instead of a real prophet as well. But obviously you can see two different authors penning this history. But yeah, the Egyptian false prophet was Jesus himself. And that gives us some more information as to who he was and what his activities were.
When you mentioned the 5,000, could you clarify what happened there? And does that have to do with the zodiac at that point?
Yes. Well, yes, it does. Again, everything in the New Testament is done on two levels. And so this was symbolic rather than being actual, of course. If you read the New Testament, and if you compare it, of course, with the Nag Hammadi Gospels as well, it's quite clear that bread means knowledge. So we're not talking about real bread here. We're talking about knowledge. The leaven was how that knowledge spread, if you read the parable of the yeast. But if you read the section on Jesus and the Greek woman, where he calls the Greek woman a dog, and she says, "Ah, yes, but even the dogs can have the crumbs from the table of the master." It's clear from that passage, and where it's also given in the Nag Hammadi Gospels, that bread, the bread that they were passing around at the table, was a reference to knowledge. And that's what she wanted, the Greek woman. She didn't want pieces of bread from someone's table. She wanted snippets of knowledge from the master. That's what she was looking for. And then Jesus calls her a dog for wanting his information, because she was a goyim. She wasn't entitled to this sacred secret knowledge.
If that's the background, what would you say? How does that affect the way we would interpret the Lord's Supper? Like the bread and the bringing in the blood there as well. Like, do you think that has an esoteric meaning in terms of if bread is knowledge, would blood mean something different, or is that a stretch? Could that be referring to something different there?
It could be. We'll come back to that. But just going back to the feeding the 5,000,
yeah,
they were fed the bread, the loaves, and the fishes. Now, if we know that bread is knowledge, then the fishes is the zodiac constellation of Pisces.
right.
So what was being given to the 5,000 who were out in the wilderness was a lecture on the precession of the equinox. And so he was talking to these people about the knowledge of the new great month of Pisces, which had only just come into force in AD 10. It was very recent. He was the first of the Fisher Kings. You know, from Arthurian legend, we had this famous line of Fisher Kings. Jesus was the first of the Fisher Kings. It was all about Pisces. This is why Jesus was called a fisher of men. This is why the chief symbol of Christianity became the fish. This is why the Pope wears the fisher ring. And this is why the Pope has the fish head mitre on his head, which looks like a fish, because this was the new great month of Pisces, and he was the first of the Arthurian Fisher Kings. And so he was teaching these people the knowledge, the bread of the movement of Pisces becoming the dominant constellation. So again, not a miracle. This was esoteric education. This was a mystery school, and he was teaching these people the mysteries of the precession of the equinox. So very important, you know, but rather different to the very simplistic surface miracle that is taught within the church. The blood and the wine, I'm not entirely sure if I've written about that, but just thinking about it, Jesus would not have been drinking blood, symbolic blood as wine. The basic taboos that even Saul was given when he wanted to go off and teach to the Gentiles was he was told by James, the brother of Jesus, that your rules must include not drinking blood was one of the rules. So Jesus himself would not have been drinking symbolic blood. So bread as knowledge and blood as, I don't know, a bloodline. I'd have to think about that. I've not really thought about that one, but that is interesting.
I'll save blood that one for our...
Yeah, it's the one for later. Yes, but all of these things are symbolic. There is a lot of these, and same within Arthurian legend. A lot of it is symbolic as well.
Yeah, and when you mentioned the fish too, that with the Pisces vesica brings us back to, again, sacred geometry and Pythagoras yet again.
Yep.
It's amazing.
Yep, it's all there. It's all written in the books, but you need to interpret.
Well, I was wondering if we could shift gears for the last part. This is going to be quite a shift, but I'm sure there'll be some overlap. But I wanted to ask you to give us your insights on the history of Mithras and just how that affects everything that we've been thinking through, not just necessarily in this conversation, but just about the origins of Christianity and Judaism. How does Mithraism come into the equation?
It's intimately linked. It's one and the same thing, and just a different aspect of it. And we have this history because people don't seem to understand the history of Mithra, which has nothing to do, people still think it has to do with Mithra, the Persian Mithra. It's got nothing to do with that whatsoever. Completely different. Forget Mithra, nothing to do with it. We have this history from Arthurian legend. And you might be shaking your head and thinking, oh, geez, you know, what can you get from Arthurian legend? It has a lot of history in it. Like all of these mythologies, they have a lot of history in it. And Arthurian legend is not what people think. It's not about King Arthur. Very little of it is about King Arthur. Remember, the great hero of Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea. Okay, 1st century, Judea, nothing to do with Britain, nothing to do with King Arthur, you know. Different era, different people. And that is the basis of Arthurian legend. So when you read Arthurian legend, I tell you what, it's awfully confused about the date and the places, you know. We'll go through this as a separate topic later on, but some of the books of Arthurian legend start in Mesopotamia. And that's where the story starts. You know, we're talking very different to what you would normally understand by Arthurian legend. But anyway, one of the books, as it were, of Arthurian legend tells us the story of Pompey the Great. Pompey the Great, this is the companion of Caesar, Julius Caesar. So we're going back to about, I don't know, 660 BC or whatever, when Pompey the Great became the admiral of the Mediterranean. We're talking real history here. It's got nothing to do with King Arthur. Why it was stuffed into our Arthurian legend, I don't know. But Arthurian legend is huge. The Vulgate cycle is 9 volumes at about 4,000 pages of Arthurian legend. And stuffed in the middle of this enormous great history, we have the history of Pompey the Great. And this, as far as we know, is real history. And at the end of it, it says that this was a secret history of Pompey the Great, which Pompey would not put in his memoirs because for various reasons. And so it was passed down within his household and did not appear in his memoirs. Okay, secret history of Pompey the Great. Anyway, he became the admiral of the Mediterranean. He became the most powerful general and person in the whole of the Roman Empire, which was not as big then as it became. And one of the problems he had was the Pontus pirates. Pontus is southern Anatolia, and they had a problem with pirates, and that's why he was made the admiral, to try and get rid of these pirates. And he had this big battle with the pirates, and Mithras came from his interactions with the Pontus pirates. And it had nothing to do with Mithra. It came from the king of Pontus, who he was fighting during the Mithraic Wars, who was Mithridates VI. And that's where the name of Mithras came from. And essentially, it was a very old, rather out of date version of the zodiac that was held by the Nazarene. So if you look at the main image of Mithras is the tautoctomy, I think they call it, the killing of the bull. So you have this image of Mithras stabbing and killing the bull within a circle and various elements at the bottom. And normally the circle has the signs of the zodiac around the circle. And what is this imagery? It is procession. It's the procession of the equinox. So Mithras is Orion. And Orion is killing the bull of heaven, which is Taurus, to usher in the new great month of Aries. So the event it is portraying happened in 1750 BC. So it was supremely out of date by the time it got to Rome and it got to Pompey the Great. Nevertheless, they took it and they made these subterranean chambers in which they venerated this imagery of the procession of the equinox, even though it was 2,000 years out of date by that time, but there we go. And that is the basis of Mithras, but it was based upon the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's the same story. So in some ways, you might say it came out of the East because the Epic of Gilgamesh is exactly the same. So what is the Epic of Gilgamesh? Well, it's Gilgamesh trying to kill the bull of heaven. And Gilgamesh has a problem because before he can get to the bull of heaven, he must kill the 6 splendors of the Humbaba. Okay, sounds like complete mythology. But what sits on the, because the Humbaba were protecting the neck of the bull of heaven. And what sits on the neck of Taurus in the constellations in the sky above? It's the Pleiades, the 6 stars of the Pleiades. They sit on the neck of Taurus. And so it's quite obvious that Gilgamesh was trying to kill the Pleiades before he could stab the bull of heaven, which is Taurus. And again, it's pretty obvious that Gilgamesh is Orion, the great arbiter of the heavens. If you look at the heavens above, if you look at a zodiac, you have the ring of the zodiac, all of the zodiac signs around the outside. In the center, you've either got what we had in Arthurian legend, which is the northern constellation of the Great Bear, Ursa Major, or sitting on the ring around the circumference is Orion. And of course, Orion has his arms stretched out to Taurus, who sits right next door to him. So if you look at the night sky, it's like Orion is already trying to kill Taurus, which is sitting next to him. And Orion, of course, is Hercules within Greek mythology. Orion is Hercules. So we had this great picture, cosmic picture, which has been used down the millennia of Orion being the ringmaster, the arbiter of the cosmos. He is the one who drives the constellations around in their big circle and decides who is going to be and when is going to be the next processional constellation within the zodiac to be venerated. And in 1750 BC, Orion killed Taurus, the great month of Taurus, in order to usher in the great month of Aries. And that's why all the following kings and pharaohs and so on identified themselves with a sheep, just as Alexander the Great identified himself with a sheep, and the Ptolemies of Egypt, and Jesus himself as the Lamb of God. They all identified themselves with a sheep, the great shepherd.
And Jesus, I was going to say, Orion, in the description of in terms of him not as a constellation but as a god, he one of his powers was that he could walk on water. And I think it's fascinating that Jesus walks on water with his, how many disciples? 12.
Like, yes, of course.
They're almost putting it on a platter for you. Like, how can you not?
How can you not see it? Yes. Yes, these kings could be either of these 2 characters, because you have 2 great arbiters of the processional zodiac. One is Orion, because he's such a, obvious constellation within the night sky. And the other arbiter was the Great Bear at the center of the zodiac. And that's why King Arthur got identified with the Great Bear. That's why he's known as Arthur. And the other great character you could be associated with is I think they called him Sar in Egypt, which was Orion, the Hercules figure, standing there, with his arms up. And Gilgamesh does the same. I mean, and again, I wrote to some academics about that, and they couldn't really see the similarities. But Gilgamesh is armed. He's armed with a shield and a club and a sword on his belt. And you think, who in the night sky has his big shield and his club, and he's got a sword hanging from his belt? The description of Gilgamesh is identical to Orion, and it's pretty obvious this is a story of the heavens and not a story of a king in Babylon, Persia. And it changes the story again, which is perhaps one of the reasons why they can't accept it, because they say, dating these texts and so on, that the story of Gilgamesh is, 2500 BC or something. It's very, very early. Well, not if it's the Orion killing the bull of heaven, it's not. If it's Orion killing the bull of heaven, we know exactly when this story was written, because we know when the bull of heaven was killed in the procession of the equinox, and that was 1750 BC. So we can date the writing of Gilgamesh to precisely 1750 BC. So again, it changes the era, and maybe that confuses academics. I don't know why, but they still can't, because I wrote about this 25 years ago, and still academics cannot see that Gilgamesh is actually Orion, and it's a story of the heavens.
I applaud you for what you're doing, because despite people's unwillingness to let the scales fall from their eyes, it's obvious, and it's so the pattern keeps on. What's amazing to me is that this pattern keeps on popping up. You have Gilgamesh as the same as Orion. You have Mithra, the same as Orion. You have Jesus doing the same thing as Orion, walking on the water with the 12 disciples. And it's like they're basically rehashing the same story, but of course, every time with a different nuance, of course, with more and more of a Jewish flair to it, with the blood sacrifice and the scapegoating with Jesus. But it's the same story, but it's been adapted for the new context, for the new culture. So they've made some things very parallel, and they've made some things a little bit different to say, we're improving the story. Our hero is better than your hero, and yet you can see where it came from. You can see the evolution. It's very clear.
And I do wonder sometimes if some people do know about this, because you get hints of this down through the ages, but it doesn't seem to break out into common knowledge. So if you look at the constellations, someone made a very famous book of the constellations. We're talking back in the 18th century here. And the picture they have, and many of the pictures they have in various similar books of this, if you look at the character of Orion, the way he's standing with one leg bent and leaning out with his his club and his shield or whatever he's got, and then you look at that, and then you look at the image of Mithras, the stance of Orion is exactly the same as Mithras, the way he's kneeling on the bull and stretching out to stab the bull with his dagger, and he's got his scabbard down between his legs. It's identical. And you think, well, is that just sort of coincidental because that's how Orion looks in the northern skies? Or did the guy who made this illustrative star chart, did he know that Mithras was Orion, and that's why he drew Orion in that fashion? I don't know, but you get these sort of indications that some people may have known about this. For instance, in Arthurian legend, it's a whole new topic. We'll do a whole new talk on that at some point. But in Arthurian legend, you get lots of hints that the authors knew the story I have told about Edessa. So in the last story, we went through that big story about Edessa, about Jesus being linked with Edessa, being linked to the Jewish revolt. And then you read Arthurian legend and you think, well, whoever wrote this must have known about Edessa, because otherwise, the links and similarities between these two stories are so similar that they must have known about it, which means the Knights Templar must have known this story. Maybe that was the big secret that the Knights Templar had. And that's why they were feared by the Catholic Church, because they had this big secret, which was the city of Edessa. Because remember, interesting note, maybe as a sort of semi-final note on this, the Crusades, when they went to the Levant, this would have been 1096 on the first crusade led by Count Baldwin of Boulogne from northern France. It didn't go to Jerusalem. So they went down through Anatolia, and instead of turning right and going down to Jerusalem to save Jerusalem, Guess where they went to? They went to Edessa. So the first city that was liberated from Muslim control during the First Crusade was the city of Edessa.
Mm.
And that's crazy because I didn't learn about that until well after I had written my book about Edessa. So I write this book about Edessa saying that Jesus came from Edessa and this was the pivotal city that was involved in the gospel story, etc., etc. And then I start writing about Arthurian legend and I read up the First Crusade and they went to Edessa. And I'd never heard of Edessa before I'd written my book. And suddenly again, all of these pieces of the jigsaw puzzle start fitting together. And that was just one of the pieces that came out and went straight into its slot. Didn't touch anything on either side. It just dropped straight into its slot in the jigsaw puzzle. And that's what happens if you're mining a true thread of history. That's what happens.
That's awesome stuff. Well, I did just want to ask, kind of as we're wrapping up here, as you look at all this stuff and you do see a lot of pushback from the scholarship and certainly from the church, what do you think is going to take for this stuff to be, number one, common knowledge, and number two, for people that otherwise you would expect with their PhDs and their background and their supposed willingness to truly look at all the facts and then make a decision? What do you think it's going to take for them to be willing to look at some of this stuff and say, yeah, this is what we should have been looking at all this time?
Well, they always do say that scholarship only advances one death at a time. Because that is true. You have to get rid of the old guard before the new ideas can shine through, because it's the old guard who control the education system. They are the people who give the grades to the new students as they come through. And so they maintain the academic structures and the historical structures and the theological structures. And until the old guard die off, there's very little chance of change. I'm hoping I've changed a few minds of the new graduates coming through, but I don't think I've changed many, because a lot of my critics are fairly young academics. I had a young lady academic from Exeter University, was it, who was very vocal against my idea that Jesus came from Edessa. And the thing I don't like about this opposition is they won't engage. They won't discuss. So my story got into the newspapers, basically. So they did an article in one of our British newspapers. And so the newspaper, of course, goes along to get some commentary by a theologian. So they went to a university and said, what do you think of this? And they said, complete rubbish, without reading the book. Okay, so they're commenting from a position of ignorance because they hadn't read the book, and they say, oh, it's complete rubbish. Fine, okay. The newspaper wanted an immediate commentary, so that's the immediate commentary they got. So I engage now with the academic and say, well, actually, on what basis did you say this was a load of rubbish? What do you actually disagree with, and can we discuss it? No. Can't discuss it, won't tell me what is wrong with my research, because they can't, of course. Once they actually start looking at it, everything I've taken is from original manuscripts. Okay, it might be my interpretation, but everything I've taken comes straight out of ancient history. What did I say that was wrong? No reply. And, I tried time and time again with 3 different academics, because they got the same answer from 3 different academics. No one would reply. What they try and do is they hide behind their supposed superiority. They've got a PhD or whatever they've got in I think they were all theologians. I don't think they were historians. Um, and they are not going to be persuaded. They're not going to be changed. They won't even discuss it. And so we're not going to move academia along if the new generation are not even going to discuss, if they're not going to engage. And that was disappointing that they wouldn't. They were just hanging on to the same old structures that they've been taught for hundreds of years.
It's really a great example to me of why it's really ridiculous and honestly kind of dangerous to hold the respect that we do for the consensus on almost anything. It doesn't mean the consensus is necessarily wrong, but I mean, there was a consensus for hundreds, maybe thousands of years that the Earth was the center of the universe. That was the scientific consensus. There was a consensus even just a generation or two ago that smoking was completely fine and even good for you. You know, you can still see those ads from the 30s, 40s, 50s of the last century of doctors saying, it's a good thing even for pregnant women. The consensus was that the Titanic was seaworthy. I mean, you have consensus over and over that is just absolutely wrong with sometimes within a generation. And I remember the classic example that came up early in some of my studies was this guy Tommy Thompson talking about, the some of the stuff with Moses didn't this doesn't work right. This isn't truly history. They wrote him off, and within a generation, everybody was saying, yeah, he was right. And it's like the idea of consensus, whether you're talking about the consensus within academia of Christian academia or secular, or even honestly within mythicist academia, where you have some people that are kind of like, oh, this is our superstar, his perspective or her perspective's got to be the right one. Like, just because people tend to congregate to a superstar and say, well, they're going to be our spokesperson, that has nothing to do with whether or not what they're saying is actually accurate and whether or not they deserve the attention that they got. And it staggers my imagination that even people that have gone so far as to say, I recognize Christian, I was in Christianity, I was totally on board with it, I was on fire for the Lord, I went all the way out, finally realized it was mythology, and I got out of it, I deconverted, and then they go to like, but this guy, his interpretation is the only one that's right, and everyone else is absolutely, off the charts wrong. It really begs the question of whether or not we've deconverted from a mythology, but have we deconverted from fundamentalism? And I'd like to say, I hope that some of that kind of starts to go hand in hand as we get further and further along in our journeys, to say there is more to this story. And if you have kind of shut the door, put your blinders on and said, I know exactly how Christianity started, and I'm not listening to anybody else, you're going to miss so much. And honestly, the other stuff you're missing is really cool. It's really cool.
Unfortunately, within academia, I think they're going backwards, not forwards. I don't want to get political, but when you see academics claiming that there are 72 genders, which has been happening recently, literally over the last couple of years, this has suddenly come out as a thing within academia. You have to wonder where academia is going to. Are they looking at, rational truth or not, or just jumping onto bandwagons? I really don't know. But if they continue down that road, then we've got no chance at all of getting a rational next generation. What I'm hoping is that I've persuaded so many people that they will get kickback from lots of different people who say, oh, yes, but, someone, the Ellis character said that this makes more sense. And it does. It makes more sense. So what do you say about this? And if they get enough kickback from enough people, whether it's on, in the media or whether it's online or wherever, maybe they'll have to change their minds a little bit. I do wonder, I've had a number of arguments recently with people on my YouTube sites and Facebook sites, and I've had previous supporters now coming back to me as critics and saying I'm all wrong. Yeah, okay, but the way they're doing it is not a rational debate. It's just literally, you're wrong, and they don't want to have any debate about, the merits of the case. But I'm heartened that, on your YouTube site and many of the YouTube sites that I've done lots of YouTube videos myself, which are all online. Although I think they're shadow banned because they're very difficult to find. But anyway, if you search diligently, if you come up with a YouTube thumbnail with a sort of red phoenix on it, that's my video. And I've done quite a few myself. And I get a lot of good feedback from those. So I'm hoping there's a good many thousands of people who will argue the point down through the ages, down through the generations later on, and just put this out into the public arena. What do you think about this? This was this new interpretation of this particular topic, and it sort of makes sense to me. What do you think about it? And if enough people do that, then hopefully we'll change some minds within academia, and maybe within the priesthood, but I doubt it. Although you might within the Christian within the Church of England.
Yeah.
The Church of England is a very laid-back church. I don't know if people in America are familiar with it. It's very rational. Always has been looking for the real history of the biblical texts. They did a wonderful survey of C of E priests some time ago this is quite a long time ago as well. This is about 30 years ago. They did a survey of C of E priests, and they said, do you believe in God? The way they phrased it, though, was, do you believe in this God, who intervenes in personal life and so on? And more than 50% of them said no, they don't believe in God. So within the C of E church, you have a body of people who are normally fairly rational, not like, the Methodists or the Pentecostals or whatever church you were a part of. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So that sort of priesthood might get persuaded, but there are many that won't.
Yeah, I came from more of a conservative Baptist background, and I'm sure well that over here in America, there's just the fundamentalism is off the charts. The good news is when you see some of these, these surveys that they do of people, just the general population, it seems like churches are emptying. I mean, I know a lot of it's related recently to COVID, but just over the last few decades, the numbers have been going down, and so there definitely does seem to be a trend in the right direction where people are willing to step away from this. And some of it, unfortunately, like you said, is just the older generation is passing, and the next generation is just saying, look, we respect you as our elders, but this doesn't make sense of reality anymore. We love you, but we're not going to live like that, and we're not going to think like that. And as the older generation passes, it just goes away.
Yep. I think in Britain, we're 50 years ahead of you. I think in America, our fundamentalism has gone. We don't really have fundamentalist churches anymore. Our church numbers have dwindled to almost zero. If you go to a church service now, you'll see a few pensioners at the front, and they're only there to see their pensioner friends. That's the only reason they're there, really. We've got quite a few churches, and we're talking old churches. We're talking churches that are 800 years old, have been turned into cafes and whatever because they just don't have a congregation.
Yeah.
The same's happening in Masonry. So within the Masonic world, again, not so much in America, but in Britain, we have lodges closing down because they don't have any members anymore. Again, it's not relevant to modern life. Going to your lodge as a Mason was very much like going to church on a Sunday. It was very much the same thing. You have the church service, as it were, the lodge service with the same people. You have the same sort of liturgy. It all comes from the Old Testament. It's all very, very similar. And of course, back in the sort of Victorian era, that's what you did. You went to the church on the Sunday, and you went to lodge on the Wednesday or the Tuesday or whenever your lodge met. And it was very much the same sort of thing. People don't do that now. They don't go to church on the Sunday. They don't go to lodge on the Wednesday. So in our lodge, the average age, I was the youngest person. The average age in our lodge was something like 4 years old or something, you know. In effect, the lodge only had 10 years to go before it ran out of people. It's very much dying on its feet, and the churches are doing likewise. So yeah, perhaps they might be forced to reinterpret what they're doing, their liturgy. I don't know. We shall see. But I hope they become more rational, because the last thing we need is fundamentalist religion taking over again. The only caveat to this is I hope that what I'm doing doesn't reduce Christianity, but allow Islam to take over, because that would be worse than the destruction of I mean, I'm not looking for the destruction of Christianity. I'm just looking for rationality and history. But if it results in a reduction in Christianity, which allows the fundamentalism of Islam to come to the fore, that would be an own goal, because that is a fundamentalism that has never been challenged and doesn't look like it will be challenged in the near future, because it's always given a free pass. Whatever happens, whatever they do, it's always given a free pass. And whatever is done in the name of Islam is always, oh, well, that's not real Islam, you know. It's not the way, you know, it's a religion of peace, honest, you know, which again is all complete lies and so on. Yeah. So I hope we don't allow Islam to have a free rung into getting on into the Western Hemisphere.
So I do want to mention you mentioned your YouTube channel. For anyone that hasn't been to Ralph's page, it's got amazing videos there. I'll have the link right beneath our video. So please, as soon as you're done here, go like and subscribe, click on the bell so you see all of his work. And please do support what he's doing, and as well as the link for his website. You can go buy his books and see what else he's got there. But amazing stuff. And I just want to say, Ralph, thank you for what you're doing. What you're doing is absolutely priceless. There's a few people that just, in my mind, just kind of come to the surface of the importance of these discussions, and you're certainly one of them. And I love what you're doing. Can't wait to dive into your books, and I encourage other people to do it too. So thank you for what you're doing. And I'll just end by saying this: I look forward to the next conversation with the Arthurian legend stuff. That sounds honestly fascinating. So I need to get a little bit of background myself so I can ask some good questions, but I would love to dive into that with you at some point.
Yeah, that would be great. And to your viewers and listeners, if you ask questions on the YouTube site, your YouTube site, I normally get back, not immediately. I only sort of pass by there every couple of months or so. But if there are any good questions on there, I normally answer them. So that's a good way of getting hold of me. I also have a Facebook site, which is Ralph Ellis 144. And I answer questions on there as well. So I tend to, I try and engage, because I find it very informative. People come out with very good questions, which are challenging, and I have to answer them, and that's challenging. I have to do more research to answer them, because I get some very good questions. And normally they're answerable. I normally manage to answer pretty much 95, 99% of the questions that I get thrown at me. And it's good stuff. It's a good way of researching. It's a good way of people identifying the areas that I haven't explained fully enough. Because I'm writing from a position of knowledge, and it's very difficult sometimes to put myself in the shoes of someone who doesn't have that knowledge. And they'll come up with a question, and I think, well, yes, I've not explained that well enough, have I? And then we can go back and fully explain that particular topic. So yeah, do ask questions, and I'll come back and answer.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ralph. This has been amazing as always, and I love what you're doing. So I look forward to the next time. Thank you again for your time today. This has been great.
Thanks, Tim. Bye-bye.
Thank you.